Hello there, and welcome back to another video. This is the 7th episode of the story about how Naruto's life changed after the seal shattered. He's been thrust into Anbu. He's losing track of which half of him is him and which half is his demon. He can't seem to find his way back to Team 7, and he's been having these strange dreams, with a sky ripped apart by a broken moon, a man with a staff, and a version of himself with glowing, nine-tomoe eyes. This story is from Slexinski. Make sure to support him, her. Like and subscribe to show your support. Let's get this party started. The depressed heart and the dirty lie. Naruto wasn't sure what he expected to happen when he crossed the border. To be honest, the other side of it didn't feel all that much different than High no Kuni, and for that matter, there wasn't much to mark the event either. The land of fire ended in a fine field of yellowed wheat, dry and hot. They'd been told by a wandering farmer not to go too far into the grasslands. Apparently, they were a great place for wildfires. Naruto didn't doubt it. The air was barren and prickly against his skin, and he could feel the heat from the ground beneath him. To his left, Sasuke did not appear even remotely moved by the oppressive heat. Just wait, he sighed, motioning towards the ravine they were drawing closer to, far on the other side of the field. It's going to get worse. Naruto didn't know how it could get worse. But it did. The dusty, arid land gave way to a cold, murky humidity the moment they crossed the fields. The very earth itself seemed to give way to it, sloping abruptly into large, buffeting cliffs. Tumbling down into the depths were rivers of clouds, obscuring the bottom from view. "What did I tell you?" Sasuke asked aloud, sounding bored. Or, perhaps resigned. It was hard to tell. Naruto rolled his eyes. "How did you even know, anyway?" "Because I picked up a book before we came here, obviously," he retorted, lacking any bite. The blonde was fairly relieved to see their friendship had mostly reverted back to normal. It wasn't quite the same, but that might even be a good thing. Sasuke was less antagonistic than he had been before, though he still took every opportunity to berate the blonde when he could. Still, it didn't feel anywhere near as annoying as it used to. But Naruto had bigger concerns than Sasuke at the moment. "What the hell do you mean, Uzumaki scrolls?" Naruto demanded of his tenant. "Don't think I've forgotten about that." "And Uzushiogakure? What is that?" Curiously, Kyubi seemed rather unwilling to answer. "I had no intention of explaining the real reason we're here. That was simply a very convincing cover." "Yeah, I got that," was Naruto's annoyed riposte. "But I'm more interested in knowing why that lie was so convincing in the first place." The fox did not respond. The blonde scowled. "You never tell me anything." He attempted valiantly to keep the whine out of his voice. Attempted and missed by a mile. To his surprise, his sad and quiet confession actually had an effect on the demon. "Perhaps this question is better directed towards your teacher," the fox noted with a sigh. Naruto blinked rapidly. "Why is that? Do you even have any idea where to go?" Sasuke asked, jolting him out of his conversation. He shook his head. Whatever. If he couldn't get it out of the fox, then he was definitely going to get it out of someone back home. "No," he replied to the Uchiha, with far more cheer than necessary. "But when in doubt," he continued, jovial, "it's always best to follow your nose." "Great," was the Uchiha's unenthusiastic response. Strewn indeterminably through the valley were large billowing clouds of mist, restless giants at the foot of the mountains. He watched the tenebrous clouds spill through the folds of the peaks, the glorious sun burning an archaic gold from behind the drifting fog. The base of the towering summit was largely obscured through the mist, but the smell of water lay cold and sharp in the atmosphere. Naruto pointed west. "That way," he said. His companion shrugged. "West it is, then." The pair descended from the lofty peaks and into the abyss with little fanfare. Conversation turned seldom as the billowing clouds drew upon them, a thick, besotted veil the cloying darkness so still and silent it felt imperative not to disturb it. An efflorescent light, blinding and opalescent, begins to smolder against the side of his cheeks. It lights against his eyes, the subtle downward turn to his mouth. The other half of him is doused in shadow, indiscernible but for the unending, annulated eye. It is not any color he can determine, but it reminds him of the moon. His mouth moves, but the words wander slow and leisurely, as if crossing a great distance. The world is vast and infinite before them, and in the calendar of his bones he feels restlessness, as if the very marrow of his blood awaits the advent. The stars shiver above them, a shifting, scintillating pattern that winds across the stratosphere. He feels so very alive, wroth with the tumultuous energy of the world that seeps into his veins, loiters in the narrow channels of his blood. All at once he feels full of life and terribly alone. But there is a boy by his side that he has never seen before, wearing a delicescent smile. He stares into the wicked sky, as if contemplating time itself, lost there in the places full of light and lament. A silent wind picks ineffectually at his dark hair, his eyes are lit and luminous, full of rings and stars. They remind him of the night, so cold and constellated. He turns to the boy with a breathless wonder, compelled suddenly to reach out and touch him, feel the vivacity that lingers there underneath his skin. The boy turns, his smile widens into something significant. He doesn't know what it means, reaching closer, wondering what this feeling is. He touches the side of his hand. Human. This is what he feels. He feels human. Naruto stirred, blinking up into the washed light of morning, picking the pieces of himself back up from where he'd dropped them, wandering his way out of his dreams. They'd changed, again. There was a boy in them, with fallow brown hair, wholly unrecognizable and definitely someone he'd never met before, but he felt familiar nonetheless. He felt so alone, weirdly, though he knows if he wanted he could reach out and smack Sasuke over the head. As it was, he turned his head to peer sightlessly towards his companion. Sasuke was awake, staring indeterminably into the distance. What's with the long face? Naruto yawned, pushing himself off the ground. Sasuke blinked out of his reverie, frowning slightly. For a moment, he looked as if he wouldn't say anything at all. Finally he shrugged. What are we here for? Huh? Naruto returned absently, rubbing at his eyes. Here, in Kumo, Sasuke reiterated. Why? He debated for a moment. Well, do you want the long answer or the short answer? Sasuke spared him a dubious, irritated look. Both. Short answer, Kyubi. Naruto cracked his neck. Long answer? A lot of reasons. First, I thought it might not be such a bad idea to hightail it out of the village for a bit. Sasuke made a vague noise of agreement. Second, he waved a hand vaguely. There are things I'm looking for. Wow, the Uchiha returned, flat. How very descriptive of you, Dobe. He shot the boy a dark look. And third, he emphasized, we're strengthening inter-village relations. Sasuke blinked, scowling. How the hell are we doing that? Naruto smirked vindicatively at him, you'll see. He leapt to his feet, stretching out his arms. Kumo sprawled out around them like an unfurling blanket of clouds. The two had stopped on a precarious cliff for the night, but it was probably time to get a move on again. That said, Naruto was not entirely sure where they were supposed to be going. His first priority had simply been to make it to the land of lightning. Now though, he supposed he would have to wake Kurama to figure out just how exactly they were going to find these mythical items. West, he thought, though it didn't feel as if it came from him. The blonde peered into the sea of clouds beneath them. They overtook the mountains, crawling up through the shallow valley to pour through the dips and edges, lined in moonspill still. When he turned around once more, Sasuke had already gotten up, looking rather resigned to his fate. Which way? Naruto shrugged. West. The mountainous terrain was seeped in a besotted mist, wet and clinging to his skin. Sasuke scowled, shaking off the dampness on his shoulders. Naruto sure knew how to pick these places, he thought irritably. Or, was it really Naruto who had chosen this path? It was hard to say. He hadn't exactly been lying when he'd claimed how easy it was to tell Naruto apart from the demon. There were still parts of Naruto that were intrinsically the same. He still said the stupidest things at the most inopportune moments, he was still seriously dense and naive. But at the same time, he was tactful and insightful, he knew how to look underneath the underneath. He was far too observant. He seemed to flicker through this taciturn personality and his normal obliviousness as if they were supposed to be able to peacefully coexist with each other as if they weren't two totally polarizing parts of him. Almost as polarizing as the relationship between him and the fox. Not to mention, the demon was right. The realization that Naruto was a Jinchuriki certainly shed some light on certain aspects of him, but it would be utterly remiss of him to assume he was strong only because of the fox. Naruto might be rather self-depreciating and modest about it, but it hadn't been the fox who had beaten him that day by the waterfall, nor was it the fox who fought him in the training ground hours later. Naruto was strong. More than that, he was clever. Quick on his feet, wholly unpredictable. There was nothing worse than an opponent you couldn't get the drop on. Naruto knew how to improvise, and fight on the fly, against anyone, at any time. It was annoying, actually. Case in point, the two of them are walking through an unfamiliar, unfavorable terrain with little visibility and a whole lot of blind spots. In one moment, everything is still and silent. In the next, Naruto is engaging three unidentified operatives, who all had a way of seeing through the dense fog and knew the terrain far better than they did and still managed to come out the victor of the scuffle. Sasuke also noted that Naruto did not go or the killing strike. He'd only meant to disarm. Sasuke took down the last one as Naruto made quick work of the other two, refraining from going for the jugular as well. Why do people always fight first and talk later? Naruto griped to himself, shaking his head. He held out his hand to Sasuke, and it took him a beat to realize the blonde was asking for their paperwork. He threw it to the Anbu, who caught it and unfurled it in one fluid snap. "Hi." He grinned brightly. "We're here on business officially sanctioned by the Raikage. Incidentally, we're actually here for his brother. Would you mind pointing us in the direction of Kyomogakure?" Another one of Naruto's uncanny strengths, he always managed to endear himself to everyone. After a bit more conversation, the scouting team directed them to his complete lack of surprise west, insisting that if they just wandered their way blindly through the fog for a bit longer they'd come across the village in no time. Naruto appeared just as incredulous as Sasuke felt. The terrain had went from rocky and mountainous to rocky and mountainous and deadly. The landscape was littered with narrow cliffs and lethal drops that came up without warning. It was impossible to see their footing more than a couple meters ahead of them, and they'd already had some close calls. Suffice to say, the journey west was long and difficult. Naruto used a few Kage Bunshin to enlighten them and scout ahead, because he found it rather funny each time one of them accidentally fell down the ravine to their deaths. Well, it was certainly funnier with a clone than if it would be with one of them. It was also wholly impossible to tell what time it was. The world seemed fixated into an indeterminable state between not day and not night. The sky was an impenetrable, colorless ceiling above them, as was the ground around them. Naruto stopped abruptly. Then, much to his irritation. "What?" he asked, annoyed, as he almost ran into the blonde as he blindly felt his way through the mist. "Why'd you stop? Are we there?" "No," said Naruto in a curious voice. The blonde peered into the vast shroud as if he could see through it, looking pensive. His expression remained thoughtful but unreadable, until finally he frowned and shook his head. "We have company," he observed. Sasuke blinked, activating his Sharingan. If anything, the Dojutsu might just be making the fog worse. It wasn't like the Byakugan, which would have been able to spear through this fog without opposition. It sharpened his senses until everything was clear and focused, almost to the point that time seemed slower. This was incredibly useful in battle, but right now it was just giving him a raging headache. He turned to Naruto. The blonde hadn't activated his. His bright eyes flickered about, frown deepening upon his features. Finally he took a decisive step forward, and drew his hands around him. It was as if every particle of air and space trembled at his touch, convulsing upon itself before it exploded around him, parting the sea of clouds in an eruption of wind. He closed his eyes against the dust, and when he opened them most of the surrounding mountain range was cleared of fog. "If you could do that this whole time," he began, irritated, "why the hell didn't you do that in the first place?" "The fog worked in our favor," Naruto remarked. "Kumonin have devices and jutsu which allow them to see through the clouds, but even those have limitations on how far their vision goes." Sasuke felt his hackles raise at Naruto's voice. This didn't sound like the dobe. "But I've found what I was looking for," he continued, darkly. "And what would that be?" The Uchiha returned, casting a wary glance at the blonde in front of him. The fox turned to him, smiling. "I'd advise you to duck." He had a split second before he threw himself to the ground, an enormous boulder flying through the space in air he'd been in just a second ago. It crashed behind him, shaking the ground with the force of the throw. Sasuke's head snapped up. He dove towards the side as another small mountain hurtled towards him. He sprung to his feet, able to see his assailants easily without the fog to cover them. He tossed a fireball at the large man, who dodged and came running at him. He came to the excellent conclusion that his best bet would be long range with this man in the nick of time too. Just as he'd leapt out of the way, the man shoved his fist into the ground, and the earth erupted in an explosive, jagged line. Naruto was right, he cursed to himself. Why does everyone here fight first and talk later? I suppose because they erroneously believe diplomacy is dead, the blonde remarked, from behind the large man. The other nin blinked in surprise, peering down to where Naruto's frightening magic lava sword was held carelessly against his neck. Neither of them had seen him move at all. "Really, Fox?" A feminine voice snorted, as a woman emerged from behind a large jutting of rock. "You're going to lecture us on diplomacy? Observing your enemy first always proves to be a better strategy." The fox returned, smiling blandly, didn't appear at all concerned at the girl, could tell he wasn't Naruto. He pulled his blade away from the large man. Almost immediately the Kumonin turned around, and promptly grabbed the fox in a bear hug. For his part, the blonde looked stunned into immobility. "That was a good one, kid." The man laughed. "Didn't even see you move. Guess there are some benefits for being so scrawny, huh?" "Scrawny," the fox sneered, but was cut off. "You've brought a companion," the woman noted coolly, her eyes trailing towards Sasuke. For someone who appeared inspired by Kyuubi's speed, the large man was not particularly slow at all. He managed to move from hugging the fox to hugging Sasuke in the blink of an eye. "Who's this shrimp?" Be enthused, wrapping a burly arm around Sasuke. Hugging may be perhaps a bit misleading, it was more like attempted strangulation. The Uchiha glowered, but did not make any move to struggle out of the grip, probably aware it would be a lesson in futility, considering the size of B's arm. "Uchiha Sasuke." The blonde replied. "Sasakethis is B and ni Yujito." "Uchiha?" Both balked, in unison. "Yes," Kyuubi agreed dryly. "And I would kindly ask you to refrain from stealing him off for his bloodline." B guffawed. "Is this Konoha's version of Trust Falls? Consider it a gesture of good faith." Kyuubi shrugged. "In Konoha's defense, the Raikage did send out the two of you. If anything, the two nations are testing each other equally." "Great." Yujito sighed. "That's why we're here. To test how truthful and honorable a ninja village will be to another." Doesn't that sort of defeat the point of being ninja? Occasionally even ninja must form alliances. The fox retorted, darkly. He shook his head. But that's not entirely why we're here. At this, everyone turned to the demon questioningly, Sasuke especially. He wasn't actually sure what the real reason they were here was. Naruto had been particularly vague on the subject, and he wasn't sure if that was because the blonde was avoiding the topic or simply had just as little of an idea of why as Sasuke did. So why are we here then? There are 5 lost weapons of great power scattered about the land of lightning. Kyuubi revealed. And I intend to find all of them. In the meantime, this might prove to be a useful time to learn a few new skills. Sasuke blinked rapidly. You want us to train? Here? Attempting to train on these cliffs might warrant a broken limb at best, death at worst. Not to mention lightning while huge, Sasuke thought, disparaging. Finding those lost weapons was going to take forever. It was clear Yujito and B had come to the same conclusion, judging from their incredulous expressions. B snorted. Who, back up there shorty. Why are we going to waste our time helping you collect these weapons for yourself? Kyuubi blinked. Who said they were for me? If anything, this only made Sasuke that much more uneasy. Why would Kyuubi give away objects of apparently infinite value and infinite power? And why to them? No one had an explanation to give to him, except perhaps for Naruto, but the blonde was being suspiciously tight-lipped about it all. Not that this meant the journey was anything approaching silent. B managed to hold enough conversation to entertain a whole room full of people, and that wasn't even to remark upon his atrocious attempts at freestyling. He'd been attempting to get Naruto to try it with him for the better part of the morning. I don't know how to rap, the blonde protested, weakly. You don't have to know, B insisted. You just have to let it come from the heart. That sounds like total bullshit. What? B gasped. Yujito leaned in close to the other blonde. The trick is to just say the words, fuck and pussy, a whole bunch of times. She revealed, conspiratorially. You'll get it eventually. This was utterly ridiculous. Sasuke despaired his life. How did he end up here? Traveling with these idiots? Although as far as idiots went, they all were clearly capable shinobi. They might not act like it, ever, but they were indeed a force to be reckoned with. He'd learned that the hard way when B had taken him down with nothing but a lot of muscle and taijutsu. This trip had ended up being half training and half wild goose chase. One of those was proving to be more useful than the other, but Sasuke wasn't sure which it was. He wasn't exactly making progress on either front. You've got too much pride. Yujito cautioned, after she'd bested him again. And too much stubbornness. Not to mention, you're too hard on yourself. Sasuke glowered up at her, as she seemed to make herself comfortable sitting on top of him. We're all jounin' here, she reminded. That you're keeping up at all is serious progress. Not that you'd be able to tell when comparing him to the others. Or more importantly, to Naruto. He might not be on the level of the two Cloud Nin, but the blonde certainly was. He combated B's brute strength and expansive repertoire of explosive ninjutsu with speed and agility. He could dodge around the other ninja until B was blue in the face, his speed allowing for him to find openings in B's defense that no one else could get to. His strategy with Yujito was decidedly more long-ranged. With B he would duck under his guard for close-ranged combat, but Yujito was careful to never let him get close. Long-range might even be putting it lightly. Naruto either fought melee or incredibly long-ranged. Far enough to land some enormous jutsu that rivaled B's. He was beginning to notice that all three of them had very specific styles, and while they might change it up depending on circumstances, Naruto especially, they all had a superior skill that they excelled in more than anyone else. It was a trait he realized a lot of jounin shared. B was capable of holding his own against multiple opponents, he had the constitution of an ox and used it to his advantage at any given moment, overpowering his opponents and sticking it out through some serious ninjutsu attacks, and Naruto didn't hold back on those. Every strike he made spoke of years of honing his skills and developing his own style. The same could be said for Yujito. She was far harder to predict, which made her a dangerous opponent. Taking your eyes off her was a lethal mistake. Like B, she had an uncanny persistency and could take her fair share of blows, which had surprised him, given her small stature. She fought well alone, but worked well in a team. And not just with B. When they fought 2-on-2, it didn't matter who she ended up with, be it B, him or Naruto. She was always perceptive of where she needed to be to support him, in front blocking an attack or behind him with the long-ranged offensive, and she had a prolific arsenal of healing jutsu. Of course, they all healed at a noticeable faster rate than anyone else he'd ever met, but her in particular. And even Naruto was starting to develop his own fighting style, playing off of strengths and weaknesses that Kyuubi had already enlightened him of. Naruto found himself mimicking the fox more than not, but he'd never really taken the time to figure out why Kurama would take the defensive at certain points, why he would go for the killing strike, or why he would hold off. Out of the 4, or 5, technically, of them, he and Sasuke were the ones that needed the training the most. But out of him and Sasuke, he was having the easier time of it. But that wasn't all that surprising, considering his circumstances. It was never going to be fair having the fox around to help him, even when he wasn't doing it overtly or intentionally. Just by being observant, Naruto learned a lot from him. It was clear to see that Kurama not only had perhaps centuries of experience fighting and using jutsu, but had deduced the best way to go about it with Naruto's body. Hell, the fox knew him better than he knew himself. He acknowledged Naruto's small height and build, but more than that, used it to his advantage. Naruto would never be able to take a hit the way B could, nor would he ever have the defensive skills of Yujito. But Kurama didn't seem to need either of those, not when it was impossible for anyone to get close enough for the offensive anyway. He used his speed and nimbleness as both a way to attack and defend. In close combat he was deadly, but he was equally as dangerous from a vast distance. He had a way of seeming far larger than he actually was, controlling the space around him using the elements in his own jutsu, even though he took up so little space himself. It was only natural that Naruto was going to pick up on that. Whenever they stopped their trek for the day to start up training, he always made sure to get some time in himself, instead of leaving it all up to Kyuubi. In truth though, the fox didn't participate very often. He didn't exactly need to, when it was clear he was always the certain victor in any matchup. Actually, much to the fox's exasperation, he'd somehow taken up the mantle of instructor. "I don't know why you're surprised," Naruto pointed out in response to the fox's unwillingness. "You were the one who suggested using this time to train. What were you expecting, setting all this up? For all of you to be at a level far superior than you are," was the snippy response. Naruto pouted, put out. "I think B and Yujito are really strong. And I mean, the bastard and I are definitely learning a lot from them, and they're learning a lot from you, so." Kurama turned pensive at that, restless. It was making Naruto uneasy. But then it drifted away as abruptly as it came, the fox returning to his usual pissy self. "It's not enough," he replied, coldly. Naruto sighed, giving this up as a lost cause. Kurama's standards were out of this world. Did he realize that none of them had centuries of experience? And in his case, not even a decade? The blonde gazed sullenly into the campfire. What was the fox's problem, anyway? He'd been in a right foul mood ever since they got here, and considering that it was his idea in the first place, there was no reason for him to be. Not to mention Killer B and Yujito were good company. He enjoyed their dynamic. Naruto looked up, gaze softening when he saw Yujito slam B's head face first into the ground, to stop his unending litany of lyrics. The man squawked, attempting to fend her off. He was more surprised with the dynamic between Yujito and Sasuke. The Uchiha seemed to tolerate B's presence in silent suffering, and was amiable enough to Naruto. He'd always been standoffish though, so the blonde wasn't all that concerned. He and Yujito almost always picked each other as sparring partners, and actually held long, in-depth conversations. "You're better off not settling into anything just yet," Yujito was advising to him, so quiet that Naruto could barely hear it. "We've all had years to figure it out." This didn't seem to be having its intended effect. If anything, Sasuke appeared even more annoyed and perturbed. The blonde woman sighed. "You're still young, you know. It's trial and error, you'll get it eventually. You're all young." Sasuke snapped back, roughly, before he stood. "I'm getting more wood for the fire." He called over his shoulder, as he wandered into the ambling fog. Naruto debated whether he should follow him and attempt to sort out what his problem is. Ultimately he decided it might be in his better interests to just let the other boy be. Meanwhile, Kurama had an idea as to why the Uchiha was behaving the way he was, and had decided it was definitely in his best interests to intervene. After all, he didn't just expend so much effort in keeping the boy alive just to have him weak and useless. Weak and useless was a hindrance, weak and useless was dangerous. It made him far more susceptible to the whims of others. There were 3 Uchiha left in the world, the fox thought, annoyed. One of them was capable of holding his own, but would make for a good investment for the fox as a potential ally. The other was Madara. Dealing with him was going to be difficult enough. The last thing he needed was for the man to gain another Uchiha, and there was only one left to play. The fox's eyes slid to the boy, who plodded along beside B. And he wouldn't put it past Madara to be able to do so. After all, once he had realized Itachi wasn't a viable option, he must have orchestrated everything in Sasuke's life to get him instead. Kurama stopped abruptly, causing everyone to almost crash into him. "What was that for?" B scowled. He didn't answer. Instead he brought his hands up in the universal Genjutsu dispersal hand sign. The air in front of them shimmered, before collapsing upon itself. In its wake was an archaic, dilapidated shrine, overtaken by moss and bamboo, so obscured by the elements alone it barely needed the illusion in the first place. And in the center the fox found a very familiar gourd. Behind him, Yujito murmured to her fellow Cloud Nin, "I couldn't even see it." B only made a non-committal noise. But of course they didn't see it, for it was not a genjutsu. This shrine had been sealed by the great sage himself. Of course no one would be capable of seeing through the illusion. Most wouldn't even know how to look for it, let alone understand the intricate chakra flow enough to unravel it. "What is that?" Yujito squinted, moving closer. "Beni Hiseigo." Kyubi all but purred. The demon wandered closer, entering the ancient shrine, stalking around the artifact. It had been quite some time since he'd seen it last. "That's not much of an explanation," B pointed out, annoyed. "One of the treasured tools of the Sage of the Sixth Paths," the fox elaborated in response. "A very powerful tool indeed. It can capture and suck the soul out of the body." There was a long beat of silence from the group. "Seriously?" "Yes," Kurama retorted, looking irritated by their unanimous incredulity. "Incidentally, even attempting to use it requires so much chakra that Shinobi cannot use it." He trailed a fond hand down the side of the dusty artifact. "But the Sage of Sixth Paths could use it, right?" Naruto clarified. "Yes, but Hagoromo was no ordinary shinobi." The fox bit out in response, sounding offended that Naruto could even think to rope him in that category. "Then why are we here?" Yujito scowled. Kurama blinked out of his thoughts, eyes sliding towards them. "I said shinobi, dot." He noted, coolly. "Not Jinchuriki." Comprehension dawned on her face. "Oh." She blinked. He lifted it off its throne, promptly took out a sealing scroll, and tossed it inside of it. He snapped it shut, turning to look at his companions as if he'd just pocketed a pack of gum, and not some kind of legendary weapon. "Oh, not keeping it for yourself, right?" Yujito drawled, accusingly. "You'll get yours," retorted Kurama, seeming to take no offense to her tone. There would usually be at least a bristle of irritation at such impertinence. He must be very pleased indeed to let it slide. "In due time," he added. "And then, with an impossible mix of both malevolence and altruism, I have something else in mind for you." The world returned to focus very slowly, drifting light coalescing into a coherent picture of shadow and sunlight, patterns in the sky, the nebulous color which draped itself over the world. Naruto blinked a few more times, thoughtful. In the distance, he could hear Bee hacking away at the lanky, malnourished-looking pines that dotted the craggy terrain, most likely for firewood. Trees didn't find much room for growth in the soggy wasteland of Kumo, rather, they found far too much. There was not enough heat and sunlight and too much moisture, making the steep cliffs barren of most foliage. It all seemed so familiar, even though it shouldn't. Naruto had never been to Cloud before. He'd never even stepped on this side of the border, and definitely hadn't traveled through it enough to find things of significance in the gloomy mountains. The blonde rolled to his feet. Sasuke was awake, staring blearily into the tumultuous troposphere, looking as if he'd been up for some time, but unwilling to move. Considering the beating Yujito gave him yesterday, that wasn't surprising. Said blonde was curled on the opposite side of the camp, unmoving. Naruto didn't bother with an excuse, he simply wandered into the fog, intent on getting some peace and quiet to finally interrogate his fox demon. "I know you're awake," he started, bitterly. Kurama did not respond. But Naruto didn't need him to. He didn't need an explanation, not for this, at least. Not when he already knew the answer. Idle dreams washed over him again. A person glides into his darker musings with a cold indifference, a sovereign nose settled resolutely upon a stern brow and an unnaturally familiar pair of gleaming eyes, bright and endless like a syllable of destroyed silver. The Rikudo Sennin. But it wasn't all that surprising that he dreamed of him. From what Kurama had unwittingly revealed, he seemed to know him quite well. Far better than he thought the fox would ever be willing to admit. No, what was truly surprising was who he was. The body he had felt so comfortable in, as if it had been woven with threads of ice, dust and light, just for him. "You were human before." More of a statement than a question, and even then more of an accusation than a statement. The fox did not reply for some time. "What makes you say that?" He returns, at length, completely unreadable. Maybe the better question was, what didn't make him? In hindsight, considering what he knew of Kurama personally and what he could observe, it should have been rather obvious. Of course the fox had been human, how else would he know his way around a blade so well? Or know how to make such good use of his opposable thumbs? He insisted he was a being of pure chakra, a creature of energy. But if this was true, how could he have real thoughts and real, human emotion? Real, human goals, none of which he had yet to reveal, Naruto noted irritably. But that just proved he was capable of revenge, another human trait. And this was to say nothing of his vivid, disorienting dreams. The moment they'd stepped foot here he'd been lost in a sense of vertigo, as if he couldn't remember what was reality and what was a dream. Since the seal broke, all of his dreams had been significantly more lucid than they ever had been before, not to mention more meaningful, but this was taking it to a whole new level. The wicked sky, the gray and melancholy waste, the mountains which rose as patriarchs of the infant world, there was a nameless presence everywhere, in the gray soil, the air, the hollow cold clinging to his skin as a vast, unknown calamity. It was all so very familiar. It was this same scene that he wandered through in his dreams, as a boy he didn't recognize, emerging from the disorderly ocean of his thoughts. "This is where you're from, isn't it?" He continued on, ignoring the fox's question. "Where he's from? How strange, to think that the shinobi world itself started on this hollow, vacant ground. That he could walk through the same mist that the Sage of Sixth Paths had. He peered around again. Maybe not. This world, suspended between sky and geography, certainly looked as if it belonged to some timeless, diminutive universe. Yes, replied the demon. Naruto let out a breath, scratching the back of his neck. Well, that would certainly explain why all his stuff is still here, the blonde remarked. And then, frowning, why are we here, anyway? I mean, why are we really here? Kurama sighed. You could most likely figure that out yourself. To gather up all these tools? To train? Leave the village? He paused. Or, to get close to the other Jinchuriki? The blonde scoured the shrouded distance as he waited for his answer. Narrow rock face in sharp relief of the prowling fog, the color of wetness. It was impossible to discern just how high up they were, when there appeared to be no ending beneath him or above him. They'd been wandering aimlessly for days, there was no other way to put it. Even being Yujito had a difficult time scouting through this part of their country. It was very rare for any Cloud Nin to step foot in these parts. On that note, it was very rare for anyone to. The terrain was unforgiving, unmanageable, and built like a labyrinth that expanded in every direction. No one willingly stepped foot into these mountains. Well, no one except for them. And the Rikudo Sennin, apparently. All of the above, the great demon answered, shaking Naruto out of his thoughts. The tools are necessary, as are the Jinchuriki. Both are things that I can't chance falling into someone else's hands. You mean Madara's hands? Naruto filled in the blank. Yes. Kurama agreed. And others. Like that wasn't ominous. You really want me to get close to the other Jinchuriki? He snorted. You? Caring about fostering friendships? Alliances. He corrected. And yes, it is one of your strengths that you are wholly oblivious to. You have the incorrigible ability to inspire unwavering loyalty and faith in people who normally lack both. Naruto blinked rapidly. Are you complimenting me? I am capable of observing both your strengths and weaknesses. The fox sniffed, perhaps sounding even a bit uncomfortable. Naruto actually felt a bit warmed at his words. The fox wasn't always that bad. You just happened to have more of one than the other. He added, and Naruto's charitable thoughts fell away. Weaknesses can be exploited, Kyubi continued. Fortunately, I am more than capable of making up for yours. The same cannot be said for your new companions. He frowned. Gyuki and Matatabi seem to be doing a good job with their hosts, he reasoned. And the bastards definitely come a long way. Kyubi snorted, sounding as if he was too insulted at Naruto's comparison between him and the other two demons to even respond. This doesn't really explain why you're giving them away. Naruto pointed out. You might have everyone else guessing your motivations, but I definitely know one thing: they are not altruistic. Kurama was surprised into a laugh. When have I ever given anyone that impression? The blonde frowned. He hadn't. Well, not exactly. And yet, no one was dead, at least not in Konoha. The village wasn't razed to the ground, and for all intent purposes the great, malevolent demon fox had done nothing but proposition himself into an able, efficient Shinobi which seemed perfectly content to follow the orders of the Hokage implicitly. That wasn't even to remark upon all the things he'd done for Naruto. Granted, they were most likely just as beneficial to Kyubi as they were for him, but the fact remained that he had helped Naruto exponentially. I dunno. Naruto bit out, at length. And don't deflect the question. What was the question? He made an irritated noise. Why are we here? And why are you going through the trouble of finding these all-powerful artifacts or whatever if you're just going to give them away? Naruto thought the fox might have a scathing remark for that, but he only appeared amused by Naruto's impertinence. Because, Naruto, the fox replied, low. The secret to gaining power is giving it away. Naruto blinked. Huh? Are you done talking to yourself, Dobe? A dry voice called from some distance away. Naruto spun around, squinting to make out the Uchiha's dark form, far enough to be obscured with a faint film of wet mist, hovering just beside the large rock they'd used as a landmark for their campsite. The blonde scowled. Sasuke knew very well that he wasn't talking to himself. Fuck off, he returned, glowering as he ran a wary hand through his hair. Is everyone up? We're waiting on you. The Uchiha retuned, sounding irritable. He was probably just still pissed that Yujito had gotten the drop on him yesterday. Yeah. The blonde muttered. And then, louder, I'm coming. Calm down, geez. The sage of the Sixth's Path sure had a really strange way of hiding his most sacred objects. The shrine, Naruto understood. That he could see holding some kind of historical relevance. But, he'd hidden his rope in a ditch and tossed his sword into a rock. Both proved to be a colossal pain to find, even with Kurama, and Gyuki and Matatabi to an extent, being able to sense the sage's chakra. On the bright side, this made way for some serious training time. He knew Kyuubi had only tossed them all together for some sort of malevolent, self-serving reason, but he'd truly come to enjoy their time out here in the wastes. Almost to the point he didn't want it to end. He liked the easy banter between Yujito and B, and how Sasuke seemed to unwind the more time they spent away from the oppressive eyes of the village. And he'd certainly learned a lot from the man, not just straight jutsu and techniques. Yujito was probably the world's best tracker, and B was oddly insightful with his theoretical academia. And Sasuke knew a lot more about history than he'd ever let on. He'd looked somewhat embarrassed when Naruto called him out on it, giving a half shrug and insisting it was just because his clan had a lot of records. Either way, it proved to be very useful. He knew quite a bit about the items. He said they were all part of a collection of sorts, and were all mentioned intermittently throughout the centuries. He also reflected that Kurama was correct. These weapons were said to have been used to suck the souls out of others. Most thought this all to be just another fabrication in the great tapestry of shinobi history. They'd proven to be unusable over the years, in line with what Kyuubi had remarked earlier, as no one had the chakra capacity to use them. Aside from the Jinchuriki, anyway. The large broadsword was given to Killer Bee, who took to the weapon like a duck to water, and had no trouble maneuvering with the sword's girth. Yujito was equally as suited for the Kokinjo. She said she'd had some experience with using whips, and the rope wasn't all that much different. Kyuubi tested the both of them with their new weapons, and appeared satisfied with their abilities, though he was particularly adamant at the both of them refraining from using the items for long periods of time, and avoiding usage in front of others. Naruto wasn't sure what all his secrecy was necessary for, but no one questioned the fox on it. He'd become the sort of unofficial leader of this new mismatched team of traveling ninja. It didn't escape Naruto's notice that he didn't remark upon Benihiseigo, and who he intended to give it to. The blonde Black Ops shook his head, clearing his thoughts. He stretched out on his perch, settled a bit above their latest campsite, the cliff small enough to be comfortable to sit on but not for much else. Farther off, Yujito darted around Killer Bee as he brandished his new sword. She kept jumping onto the flat side of the blade before darting off, drawing the other Cloud Nin into a frustrated rage. Knowing Yujito, she was probably taunting him into further ire as well. It was one of her strategies, and a damn good one. It stopped working on Naruto eventually, once he realized that Yujito only did it to break his concentration. Sasuke had a tougher time of it, but ultimately learned to tune it out. Like the wise Jinchuriki had stated earlier, he really did have too much pride. Killer Bee seemed to forever take personal offense, no matter how obvious it was, or how ridiculous her insults were. On the subject of the Uchiha, Naruto peered down into the camp. He looked to be meditating. Or something. Naruto wondered if that actually accomplished anything. It never seemed to do much when he tried it. How many more? The Uchiha asked without preamble, not even cracking an eye. Huh? Naruto sat up further. These treasured tools, he elaborated. How many more of them are there? Naruto frowned as he hopped back onto the ground, flexing his jaw to pop his ears as he did so. He lost track of how many times they'd scaled up and down these plateaus, but judging from his ears they must be fairly high up. 2, I think. He answered, making himself comfortable next to the Uchiha. The Kahaku no Johei and the Bashōzen. The Uchiha hummed in response, closing his eyes again. In the distance, Shikisaiken struck the ground in a blow so hard that he could feel the tremors even this far away. Judging from B's cry of outrage, Yujito dodged. Naruto attempted to join him in meditation, staring off into the chromatic horizon as he made a valiant effort to clear his mind of thought. This worked about as well as all the other times he'd tried it. Why did he give them away? And after a moment, does he plan on giving them all away? Naruto frowned, pensive. The tools, you mean? The Uchiha nodded. I don't know. I guess so. The dark-haired Chunin looked both incredulous and irritated. But why? He stressed. The blonde rubbed his forehead wearily. He didn't really give me much of an explanation. None that Naruto understood, anyway. Sasuke blinked at that, brow furrowing. A loud clang shook through the air, as Killer B's sword hit something of equal merit. So have you decided on anything? Naruto asked after a moment. Sasuke opened an eye at that. He seemed confused on what Naruto was referring to, before eventually he shrugged. Not really. Me either. Naruto confessed. I've definitely learned new styles from B and Yujito, but I can't really decide on one in particular. You handle the blade well. The dark-haired Chunin pointed out. Quite frankly, Naruto was stunned that he even complimented him at all. It was true though, he wielded the legendary sword of Susanoo as well as Susanoo himself probably did. That said, he still felt like he was leagues away from Kurama. I guess so. The blonde hedged, weirdly uncomfortable with the remark. Do you want to stick with the sword? Sasuke made a contemplative noise. Maybe, he decided upon, though he didn't sound particularly decisive. It complements the Chidori well. That was true. Metal and electricity could work very well together in practiced hands. Something about his words stirred a bout of thoughtfulness from the demon fox, but Naruto couldn't discern what it meant. You ever thought about using a staff? He found himself saying, completely out of nowhere. Sasuke turned to him, bewildered. Naruto didn't blame him, he was bewildered with himself. What in the hell possessed him to say that? No, Sasuke answered, slowly. It's not exactly a particularly offensive weapon. Ah, good point. He rubbed the back of his head sheepishly, before he frowned, expression turning pensive. He shook his head as if to clear his thoughts, and this disorienting feeling of not being himself. It was bad enough with Kyuubi around. But now he was feeling even more lost than usual. Was he having an existential identity crisis? Naruto despaired silently. He was far too young for this shit. Why'd you suggest a staff? Sasuke turned to him fully, almost demandingly. Naruto replied, eloquent. How was he supposed to say he had no idea? You know more than you let on, the Uchiha accused. So you have to have a reason for asking. The blonde looked thoughtful. Maybe I do, he conceded at length. And then, sheepishly, but not like how you think. I just have a feeling, you know? Sometimes things will just jog my memory or something. Well, not really his memory. It couldn't be his memory, he'd never been here or encountered any of this. So that left only one obvious alternative. But trying to get anything out of the fox was a headache waiting to happen. You have a feeling, Sasuke repeated, slow and incredulous. Naruto shrugged, laughing self-depreciatingly. I'd be more descriptive, but I don't really know what it is myself. I don't even know if all these thoughts and feelings are really mine, you know? A clang from behind him. Killer Bee laughed maliciously, before there was another swing and another ground-shaking strike. The laughter turned into outrage. Probably got a hit and then missed the second. Knowing Yujito, she would capitalize on his mistake. Sasuke frowned at him, expression turning thoughtful. Yeah, he conceded, after a bit. I can imagine it gets a little confusing. Naruto blinked, not really expecting the admission. A bark of laughter escaped him. Maybe just a little bit. He tried not to think about it, out of sight, out of mind, and all that. But the overwhelming nostalgia persisted, returning like a tidal wave at the most unexpected moments. Anything could set it off, patterns the color of wetness draped upon the wicked sky, the swelling humidity roaming around them, Sasuke in sharp relief of an impenetrable curtain of silver, Sasuke, a lot, actually. He wasn't sure what it was about the other boy that inspired such déjà vu from him, but he was hit with the strong impression of seeing someone else every time the Uchiha turned to him. But who? It's not as if he'd ever met any other Uchiha. Itachi had offed the clan before he could even have a coherent memory of them. The blonde rubbed his forehead warily, trying to find some semblance of normality to steady himself with, but he felt as if he was too lost to remember what that was even like, something vacuous and hollow taking its place. Even with his new friends right before him, it was difficult to remember who he was. His name was Naruto, he liked ramen, the color orange, candy and comic books. But this was as far as he could come before faltering, unable to describe himself any further. At one point, he would have said his goal was to be Hokage, for Sakura to like him, to be better than Sasuke and have the whole world acknowledge him as the best or just acknowledge him, at all. He didn't hold that surety in his future any longer, but he had started to think he'd found himself again, somewhere along the way. He had a team now, of people who actually liked him for who he was, who knew and accepted the fact that he held the nine-tailed demon inside him. He had Kakashi, and Sakura, and even all his old classmates from the academy. He had Bee and Yujito. He had Sasuke, who knew what he was, and probably knew far more about him than Naruto would want to admit. Who still called him a moron, where some would call him a monster. And he'd even made great progress with the fox. They weren't antagonistic, at any rate, and sometimes he thought Kurama might actually be fond of him. Exasperated, but fond all the same. They definitely weren't like Bee and the Hachibi, or Yujito and Matatabi, but they'd stopped being constantly at ends with one another. Stopped being at ends, but still had their secrets. Some bigger than others. Kurama gently pushed Naruto's conscience aside, until the boy's awareness slipped away, and only the fox remained. Naruto had yet to realize that his mind could be manipulated just like chakra, and Kyuubi wasn't about to enlighten him anytime soon. The fox gazed upon the familiar scenery, gripped with such an ineluctable nostalgia it made him uncomfortable. Something lacinated and nebulous rose to the surface of his thoughts, something far too close to regret. The undisturbed landscape unsettled him almost as much as Naruto's words from earlier did. It was incredibly disconcerting, to think that perhaps part of his conscience was seeping into Naruto's. It shouldn't have been possible, but then, how else would Naruto have put the pieces together and come to the conclusion that Kurama had been human? It wasn't all that difficult to guess for those who were observant, but it was uncharacteristic of Naruto to take note of it. And why would the boy feel so forlorn and despondent, afflicted by a shapeless disquiet that he had never known? Why would he have suggested the Shikujo for the Uchiha? He wondered if this new level of synchronicity was inevitable, or aggregated by his return to a land he was so intimate with. The Uchiha turned then, throwing him a splenetic look. "Naruto, where the hell are we?" But he paused quite suddenly, eyes narrowing before widening, as if something had just dawned on him. Kyubi observed this thoughtfully. Did the boy notice the difference between him and Naruto so quickly because of his bond with Naruto, through time and friendship, or because of his bond with Kurama, through blood and destiny? "Kyubi," he caught himself, regaining his composure. "Are you going to tell us where to go, or do you want us to guess?" "Where to go?" the fox repeated, amused. "We're already here." At this, everyone blinked, stopping to turn and stare. After a beat, B looked around, adjusting his goggles as if to see through the clouds. "Huh," he said. "And where is here?" It didn't look any different from what they'd been seeing for the past couple of days. "Mount Huagao," Kurama answered, much to B's confusion. However, his two companions were far more well-read, comprehension dawning on their faces. "Kakazan?" Yujito repeated, voice high in disbelief. "It's real? Kakazan? Mount Huagao?" Killer B looked between them, growing more confused by the second. "What are you all going on about?" "The mountain of flowers and fruit," Sasuke elaborated, coolly. "It's from the legend of the great Shinobi." B blinked. Was that supposed to be helpful? Sasuke made an irritated noise. I don't know. It's a children's story. I don't really remember what it's about." Yujito nodded. "It's just a common folk tale. And then, quietly, my mother used to tell it to me." The blonde looked pensive for a moment, before she shook her head. She always changed the ending though, because she didn't like the real one. She always had the princess stay with her children and live happily ever after. I think the actual ending was far more depressing and age inappropriate. The burly man shrugged. "I don't know any children's tales," he scoffed. "I spent all my time training. I didn't have time for that shit." Yujito rolled her eyes. "It's a pretty impossible story to miss." Killer B looked to Sasuke. The Uchiha merely shrugged. B did not look convinced, however, and perhaps with good reason. Sasuke had proven himself to be a secret bookworm, so it wouldn't be surprising for him to know it. "Well, whatever," B folded his arms. "So, what's the big deal about this mountain?" "Nothing," Yujito replied, though there was still something mystified in her tone. "But I thought it didn't exist. I thought it was all just a story." And then, after a beat, "But something tells me we're not going to find ancient dragons and an army magical monkey colonies." Another beat. "Or at least, I hope not." Behind them, Kurama watched the proceedings pensively. He'd never heard of this story, but it alarmed him nonetheless. Perhaps Kushina or Mito had once been told it, but he had never paid much attention to either of them in their youth. And Naruto? Well, no one would have read such a thing to the young blonde, or read anything at all, for that matter. It appeared that it may hold some resemblance to the actual truth of things, but most likely it was so warped with time it was unrecognizable. He reassured himself that there was no possible way for any of them to know what really happened. History had a way of twisting everything into something unrecognizable. "There is always some fact in legends and folk tales," the fox interrupted. "But yes, Mount Huagao exists. In fact, we're standing in the mountain range it resides in." Not that any of them would be able to tell, the clouds were so thick it was impossible to discern even a few paces in front of the man that was with the special goggles B and Yujito had brought with them, and the occasional burst of wind from Kurama to clear it out. The fox made a disgruntled noise, before he stalked in front of them. He held his hand out in front of him, thumb and forefinger pinched together, as if holding something small and fragile. He released a quiet breath, blowing upon them inaudible, but the effects were overwhelming. The three of them had to shield their eyes from the maelstrom of wind around them, so strong it threatened to uplift them from the very ground beneath them. When the lashing winds had died down, the entire valley was devoid of fog. So much so that perhaps even a ray or two of light could be seen from the impenetrable wall of ash above them, illuminating patterns across the dramatic landscape. Kurama turned to them, pointing lazily towards the highest peak. "That's the one." Though it did not look dissimilar to the chain of mountains around it, there was something interminable to the great summit, something anticipatory. As if it did not belong to this earth. When it was clear none of them were going to stop gaping at it any time soon, he drawled, "Am I to wait all day?" This did the trick, pulling their gazes away from the illustrious view. The Uchiha scowled, Yujito glowered, and B simply snorted, "Lead the way then, fox boy." It said a lot when the fox only sighed in exasperation, not even attempting to stop B and his incorrigible nicknames, be it with a caustic retort or a punch to the back of the head. The way ended up being a winding pass up the side of sheer rock face, so steep it involved less walking and more jumping about. On the cliff walls, scaling up vertically through a terrain that threatened to crumble beneath their feet and into the endless maw below. If nothing else, it proved to be a fantastic chakra control exercise. Sasuke wasn't sure what he was expecting to see when they reached the summit. A statue maybe, or something equally as grand. The view was grand, but it wasn't a statue. A small lake pooled into a shallow basin, mist drifting across the surface like maundering ghosts. Behind it stood a gleaming waterfall, roaring in the interim silence of the mountain range. Kyubi wasted no time leaping from their perch at the lip of the pond, landing on the surface of the water and making for the waterfall. His steps did not disturb the water at all, leaving not even a ripple in his wake. Killer Bee shared a look with him that was 2 parts incredulous, 1 part mildly alarmed, but Yujito jumped right after him. He noticed that her steps definitely caused a reaction in the water, abstracting her reflection and causing sprinkling droplets to take to the air. The scene felt familiar, as if he'd seen it before. The Uchiha paused. That may be incorrect, it felt as if it was something he already knew, something out of an old legend so common it would strike everyone as familiar. Shualian Cave, he remarked, blinking in surprise as he looked upon the torrential curtain of water. But of course it was Shualian Cave, that should have been obvious. They were apparently on Mount Huago, and if this mountain existed it stood to reason that the legendary world behind the waterfall said to reside somewhere in its mountainous peaks would exist too. The demon fox stopped just in front of the grand eruption of mist and water at the base of the falls, diamonds and white clouds like peeling jade fluttering behind him. He wasn't all that surprised when the fox crouched, and then leapt right into the current. He seemed to pass right through, as if the water was only genjutsu, Killer Bee noted, frowning as he scrutinized the falls with his full attention. I couldn't sense it either, Yujito revealed, smiling drily. Just like the shrine. She connected, thoughtfully. Maybe it was genjutsu. Or maybe it was something more. Beneath the veneer lay a diminutive world that looked as if it hadn't been touched since the beginning of time. A memorial light filtered through to play upon the rocks, but there was no opening in the ceiling for the light to have shone through, and to that end, there was no sunlight to speak of in this godforsaken land anyway. And yet this did not stop the warmth from speckling against the side of his face, Yujito's hair, Kyubi's shadow. The fox moved with purpose, stalking through this world of crystals and light, picking his way around the little rivulets of running water, and all the gleaming treasures beneath it. The trickling streams all congealed together into a glowing pool that looked both inviting and warm. The water was entirely undisturbed by the falls outside, and so clear Sasuke could see straight to the bottom, where scintillating jewels caught his eye. He wondered if there perhaps truly were treasures beyond imagination in the depths of the lagoon, or if it was simply an illusion meant to ensnare those foolish and greedy enough to attempt to take them. That would certainly fall in line with the stories, he thought, though in reality it sounded sort of preposterous. Even the best genjutsu couldn't do that. But then, it appeared this archaic land didn't follow any of the chakra rules he'd learned at the academy. B and Yujito looked just as wonderstruck as he did, peering around the cavernous abyss with wide eyes. Kyubi was far less enamored and mystified by the passing scenery, making straight for a long, flat, oblong stone that seemed to float on the surface of the water. Sitting almost innocently atop it was the Kahaku no Johei, looking untouched by the millennia or so that had passed in the interim since the last time he laid eyes upon it. He didn't move any closer though, aware that there must be thousands of intricate seals and enchantments woven into the surrounding area, and in no mood to have to pick himself out of them. But more importantly, there was something of far more value which said a lot, considering these tools were already of infinite value hidden in this cave that he intended to find, with his companions none the wiser. This jar has hundreds of spells and curses cast upon it. He gestured towards it as he addressed his companions, standing a safe distance away. You'll need to find a way to get past all of them. There was a minute in which no one said anything, simply staring at him with varying degrees of incredulity, as if they expected him to be the one to retrieve it. After all, this whole adventure was his idea in the first place. Not to mention he was the only one of them who knew how. How exactly are we to go about that? Yujito returned, caustic. You're the only one who knows how to do that, you know. He shrugged, unsympathetic. I'm sure you can figure out a way. With that note, he turned around, making for the deep recesses of the cave. He waved a hand in vague farewell, replying in parting, ask Gyuki or Matatabi. And then, far too quiet for them to hear him, they might remember. The fox well and truly disappeared then, swallowed up by the darkness without a word as to why or even where he was going, much to the utter disbelief of his companions. Yujito tossed a conflicted glance towards the innocuous pot, sitting on its stone platform. Well, that's just great. She sighed, turning to Bee and Sasuke. Anyone have any ideas? The demon fox maundered his way through the darkness with a marked urgency, turning sharp corners and ducking under low-hanging ceilings as if he could see through the abyss. Naruto stirred during the trek, rising back into wakefulness only to find himself still in the folds of nothingness. Wait, was he awake? Or was he still stuck in his mind, somewhere? No, you're awake, Kurama said aloud, in response to Naruto's evident confusion. Oh, said the boy. Huh. Are you sure? It sure didn't look it. Yes, I'm sure, Kyubi snapped, exasperated. We are inside of Shuilin Cave. There was a pause. You say this like that means something to me. The fox made a disgruntled noise. He seemed to have a scathing retort on his tongue, but swallowed it after a beat, as if he thought better of it. He sighed. For once in your life, your ignorance may not be your fault. As your companions enlightened me just a few moments ago, it is a landmark thought to be fictional, and is a location which belongs to an infamous legend aptly referred to as, the legend of the great Shinobi. The blonde mused. I've never heard of it. The fox stared into the gloom, perhaps a bit regretful. No, you wouldn't have. He agreed at length. At any rate, it is said to be entirely fictional, a myth passed down through generations as some kind of shinobi folklore. Oh, okay. Then why do you know of it? Naruto returned, confused. I don't. Kurama replied. I wasn't aware of it at all until the Jinchuriki girl remarked upon it. He paused. Or at least, I was not aware of the fact it had been made into a legend. The great shinobi. Naruto repeated, thoughtful. I feel like I've heard that before. I don't know any stories, but I've definitely heard the name. Isn't he supposed to be God or something? He most certainly was not God, Kyubi replied, amused. He may be revered as something similar in this day and age, but he was just as mortal as you are. For a moment Naruto did not reply, and Kurama could almost hear the gears turning as the boy pondered this. The Rikudo Sennin, the blonde concluded, with great finality. The fox did not say anything to this, only giving a vaguely affirmative grunt in response. The atramentus dusk cleared just as quietly as it had come upon them, fading into a blinding white light, as if they had wandered into a tunnel and found themselves on the other side. But the other side of what? It took Naruto a moment to realize it was sunlight. He hadn't seen the sun in all its glory in what felt like months, and seeing the brilliant gold coat the ground once more was almost painful. When the world returned to focus, it returned as a world Naruto didn't remember. Where were the archaic cliffs, the barren land, the clotting mist? The sky loomed above him as an insurmountable dome, endless and interminable, but Naruto felt as if he could reach up and graze his fingertips against the stratosphere. He felt both invulnerable and insignificant. But his attention was soon captivated by something else. A grand temple rose from the white ground, deiform in form and structure, untouched, as if every plane and shadow had been crafted by something so grand nothing could reach it, not ice, dust, or light. "What is this?" he asked, captivated. "Where are we?" Kurama spared the view a brief glance, brief, but filled with a quiet sadness. He continued forwards, making towards the tremendous mouth of the structure, bracketed in by elaborate pillars of carved figures, glowing like diamond or gold. "Mahabodhi," Kurama replied. "Another one of the Rikudo Sennin's shrines?" Naruto returned, curious. "Does this one have one of his sacred tools?" "Of a sort," answered the fox, with a secretive smile. "And no, it does not." He looked down at the sword in his hand, feeling perhaps a bit gleeful. "It contains something of far more importance." "And what is that?" "The Rui Jingu Bang." "Right." Naruto agreed, slowly. "Again, you say that like it means something to me." The fox appeared to think deeply on this, as he made his way up the silent, looming staircase. The Sage of Sixth Paths had many sacred items, he began, quietly, but none are more important than his staff and his sword. He held up the sword in Naruto's hand. His sword, the sword of Susanoo, sometimes referred to as the Aim no Habakiri. "And this staff?" Naruto affirmed. "Is just as sacred and just as powerful." He continued. But the idea of retrieving the powerful Shikujo hadn't crossed his mind until Naruto had mentioned it. He was just as confused as Naruto in that regard. Why would the blonde have said that? Why would he connect the Uchiha to a Kakura? It hadn't even occurred to Kurama. Not until Naruto had suggested the staff as a weapon, now it made perfect sense. The Uchiha were the last remnants of the great sage to still exist on Earth, or rather, they were the most direct lineage. The other half had long since grown convoluted and untraceable. So of course the Uchiha would be fit to wield the legendary staff. He was probably just as suited for the sword, but Kurama had no intentions of relinquishing it any time soon. Not to mention that Naruto was incredibly adept with the sword. So much so that it surprised him. There was no point in attempting to train him in some other weapon. Naruto said, thoughtful. The temple was as silent as a tomb. He remembered it to be crowded with disciples, prayer songs diffused in the air, the sharp clang of training swords as young monks practiced in the courtyard. It was nothing but a hollowed, stone sarcophagus now, each of his footsteps echoing ominously in the unbearable silence. It felt very discomforting to see this place after an endless infinity had come and gone, a place that, for so long, he could only reach in his memories. And even then, it had faded into a place he couldn't reach, obscured with time until he could barely remember it, and all the memories he held here. Kurama was surprised by how much it affected him, seeing it again. Far more than he had anticipated, and he found himself more bewildered than annoyed. The demon fox was far too caught up in his own musings to realize they were bleeding into Naruto's. But the blonde kept silent, curious and fascinated by the rolling tide of thoughts flowing through him. He felt lost. He didn't know whether it was coming from him or Kurama, maybe both. There was a cold emptiness in his heart. He felt as if he was coming home, and everything was exactly how he remembered it, but he could no longer connect to it. He held something lovely and wonderful, but no longer remembered what to do with it. And now he wandered in a familiar world, only to find that he could no longer even remember himself. Naruto reminded himself that these weren't his feelings. Hell, he'd never seen this shrine in his life. Regardless, he could not shake himself out of the constricted hold it had on him. The emotions were too strong. This place must be very important to the fox, for it to affect him so greatly. Did you grow up here? He found himself asking, on impulse. It seemed to be the only rational explanation. Why else would he feel so much nostalgia, so much longing? Why would it all be washed in an immutable sadness, if he did not have something to deeply regret? No, the fox replied, after some time staring out into a distant courtyard. He turned his gaze away, restarting his trek into the bowels of the structure. I have no birth, and I have no ndm the jubi, an existence of energy. But Naruto couldn't believe that. I think Kurama has more self-identity issues than I do, the blonde thought, exasperated. Which said a great deal, for he had many of those. Kyubi continued to pick his way through the empty, ancient structure, with a gait that spoke of familiarity. He seemed to know just which winding stone path to take, passing through the courtyards of water and white marble, gilded gold statues of ancient monks, mythical creatures, intricate carvings of epic battles between man and demon. Naruto wanted to stop and look at every small embellished carving and every twisting bench leg, but Kurama was having none of that. He appeared to have a purpose for revisiting such a silent place of sorrow. The fox also knew where not to go. Naruto thought he had jumped out of his skin when Kurama ducked low in a dark passage, and flaming arrows sprang out from the wall in his wake. But of course this place would be armed to the teeth and full of traps. At any rate, Kurama knew where every one of them was, leaping out of the way of flaming walls, dropping ceilings and poison pikes. Why are we here, again? Naruto asked, frazzled, after they had barely dodged death for perhaps the third time that hour. We are retrieving the staff of Hagoromo, Kurama repeated, sounding annoyed. Naruto huffed. Did the guy really have to put all this stuff here? I can't believe how long it's taking. The demon fox snorted. Do you truly think the Rikudo Sennin would leave the most powerful artifact of shinobi history lying about somewhere for vagabonds and thieves to find it? He sniped back. Naruto gaped. Most powerful? This is not the sort of weapon to leave for others to find. Why do you think he conjured a world behind a waterfall, a mystical fog, and a stone fortress to protect it otherwise? The blonde silently reeled at the implications of this. So all this stuff of legends has just been to protect this thing? Yes, the fox answered, darkly. The waterfall itself is an eidolon only a very powerful sorcerer could break. Behind it the crystal waters are laden with priceless jewels and treasures, but these too are an illusion, meant to ensnare the greedy thieves who might try their luck at retrieving them. So it's a good thing we didn't get in that water, Naruto remarked, belatedly. You would not have returned. Kurama said in agreement. And the darkness from earlier? The curtain of shadows are also an illusion, an impenetrable, unbreakable deception. A genjutsu, I believe you would call it. The fox paused. The Rikudo Sennin was a master of all jutsu, but most especially of the illusionary arts. Oh, said Naruto, greatly surprised by this. To be honest, he had always chalked up genjutsu as something not nearly as cool, climactic or interesting as ninjutsu. It was strange to think that the father of ninja was actually a genjutsu master. At any rate, the blackness cannot be broken. There are very few who can come out the other side. This piqued Naruto's interest. You seem to do just fine. He noticed. I have been here before, Kyubi pointed out. Otherwise, I would have had as little luck crossing the barrier as your companions did. They tried to cross the barrier? Naruto's brow rose. Yesto no avail. Only a true master of the illusionary arts could find their way through it. The Uchiha being one of them. The last remaining remnants of the Rikudo Sennin would surely have just as little trouble crossing through the plains of darkness as Kurama had. After all, the legendary eyes still lived on in them, though they had changed and warped with time. At any rate, all this just meant that there were perhaps 2 or 3 people left on this earth that could find their way to the ancient temple of Mahabodhi. None of them were the kind of people Kurama would risk gaining such an unbeatable weapon like the Rui Jingubang. He was fortunate that the sword that should have rightfully been kept in eternal glory, here, beside the staff had long since fallen into disuse and myth, until even the Uchiha had assumed it was but a simple weapon. Though the Uchiha may be capable, they lacked the intimate knowledge of the terrain and the location to find it in the first place, so even if they theoretically also possessed the capability to break the illusions, they would not know where to do it, or even that they were there at all. Still, he was in no mood to entertain the idea of coming so far in his quest, only to be thwarted by something he could have avoided with just a bit of foresight. Better to retrieve the sacred items now before they could cause trouble later on. He finally made his way into the final chamber of the shrine, lined with elaborate columns of marble monks and spirits and gods, sparkling sunlight and gold. There lay the staff of the Rikudo Sennin, in all its eternal splendor, looking the exact same as it had the last time he had seen it, in the hands of the man himself. The fox noticed with great consternation that his hands were shaking ever so slightly as he moved to retrieve the staff from its final resting place. He scowled at them, consciously willing his fingers to listen to him once more. He had forgotten how greatly debilitating the human body could be. Kurama hefted the weapon into his hands, and seemed to appraise the staff in a new light, twirling it absently in his hand. He ducked, running through a few katas before feigning a deadly blow to the neck, testing the weight of the thing. Not too heavy, which was surprising. The thing was at least twice his size, and he had seen it grow and shrink far larger and smaller than this. Still, he had never actually used the staff, trained against it in the many arenas of the temple, yes, but never actually using it himself. It felt almost sacrilegious to be standing here, holding it. It did not belong to him. The staff was and always would be Hagoromo's, and the idea of anyone else, even himself, using it instilled within him a strange discord. Hagoromo is dead, Kurama reminded himself. Long dead. And what use did the dead have for their weapons? Yet, even more than the sword, the staff was forever immortalized in his mind as an extension of the great sage himself. He remembered Hagoromo teaching his sons the art of the sword, and allowing them to use it in practice. He had even let Kurama wield it. But he had never once offered up his staff. It feels powerful, Naruto remarked, after they had both stared at the Shikujo in silence for some time. More than you will ever know, Kurama intoned, gravely. And yet here he was, entrusting it in the hands of an Uchiha. An Uchiha far unworthy to wield the legendary staff, though in Sasuke's defense, he didn't think there was any Uchiha, or any person, who would ever prove themselves worthy, at that. Well, he most certainly wouldn't be handing it over to the boy now. He would probably accidentally hit himself over the head with it. The Shikujo was a deceptively difficult weapon to master, and required great perseverance and concentration. He unfurled a wave of chakra into the staff, until the great weapon retracted in on itself, becoming the size of a baton. Naruto looked on in bafflement as Kyubi went on to tuck it into his belt. It looked like any other sealing canister, so wholly unremarkable and unguessed by the eye. For now though, I would prefer to keep the staff a secret, Kyubi told the boy. So don't go around blabbering to your friends. I wouldn't, Naruto protested. Kyubi snorted, not assured in the slightest. Kurama returned some time later, wandering out of the impenetrable darkness at the back of the immense cavern. He stepped right through it without even a hint of difficulty. They had tried for the past hour or so to find a way through the unnatural mist, but every time they headed inside of it they were always spat out in the exact same place they'd started. The fox spared them all a supremely dismissive glance. "Are you in need of assistance?" he asked coolly, surveying the sight before him. B was on the floor, sprawled out as if he had attempted to ram his way through the barrier and had been spat back out unceremoniously. Sasuke was covered in scratches. Yujito's hair was frazzled around her face, this was to say nothing of her utterly livid expression. "Where the hell have you been?" she bit out, scowling. "I inspected the other side of the barrier," the demon fox relayed, coolly. "And?" he shrugged. "There is a world with a temple, a world?" Sasuke repeated, dumbstruck. "But it was unoccupied." Yujito blinked once, before her scowl deepened. "So we came all this way for nothing, is that what you're saying?" Kurama blinked, before motioning back towards the ancient pot standing sentinel behind them. "I would say we came out rather well." He paused. "Although I see you have had no success with removing the seals off of the Kahaku no Johei." B looked affronted. "I mean, come on, how the hell were we supposed to know how to get that shit off? You're the only one here who has hundreds of years worth of experience in this, if you will recall." Yujito bit out, acerbically. Kurama tilted his head appraisingly. He had hoped that perhaps, somehow, Matatabi or Gyuki would have remembered something, but it was clear they were just as hopeless as their hosts. The fox was struck with a solemn sense of loneliness. He really was alone. He was the only being on this earth who could remember the last remaining remnant of the great sage, and the dawn of the shinobi. "Step aside," the fox commanded, stalking forward. The wards were quite old, but this only solidified their strength. These were not the kinds of seals that would wear with age. All the same, he was more than capable of dismantling them one at a time, peeling off the layers like gossamer smoke, the distorted air around it glowing a myriad of colors as he systematically cut his way to the center. The final seal broke with a crack and a splinter through the ground. His companions leapt back, surprised by the ink that bled out of the rock, bubbling out and forming intricate, circular patterns around the Kahaku no Johei. He opened one of his sealing containers, depositing the amber purifying pot there until he needed it. His companions were silent behind him. "So, what now?" Killer Bee asked. Kurama spared a moment to be amused at this, how easily these humans came to follow his lead without question. "I assume you still have yet to master that sword." He gave a nod towards the treasured tool on the Jinchuriki's belt. Killer Bee nodded. Confused. "Well, this is a training trip, is it not?" Kyubi continued, exasperated. "The purpose of this excursion was to improve your skills and abilities. Unless you think them sufficient enough, I see no reason not to continue." That appeared to be as much of an answer as anyone needed. It felt as if they had wandered their way through this land endlessly for years, but also as if they had just stepped into it moments ago. Naruto did not feel particularly accomplished, though Kyubi had remarked on his progress, so it was clear he was progressing somehow, even if he didn't see it himself. At any rate, his companions had made the most of their waning hours, practicing dusk till dawn until they were able to wield their weapons without collapsing soon thereafter. Even though Yujito and B were Jinchuriki and had more than enough chakra to use the tools, they still managed to drain them entirely of their reserves. Sasuke was improving with his new eye. Meanwhile, Kurama could wield all of them without even breaking a sweat. Naruto had only figured out the trick to it because he happened to share the same chakra coils as the fox. The demon had supreme and unshakable control over his chakra, to the point that he could give the weapons the precise amount of energy they needed to be used, without overshooting it and exhausting himself. Naruto explained that to his fellow Jinchuriki, but it turned out that understanding the problem doesn't always mean you were halfway to solving it. Holding such indomitable control over one's chakra was not as easy as it would seem in theory. Naruto knew the logistics of it all, and they all knew basic training methods to improve chakra control, but the blonde had a feeling even the most accomplished of medic ninwo were already unanimously known as the most chakra-controlled ninja would have trouble maintaining this much precision. The blonde Black Ops scowled into the distance. The morning was full of storms, but then, it always appeared disinterred with a certain illness, both tumultuous and unstable. Regardless of the clotting of clouds above, a grey light unfurled over the dying landscape. In the dark and bare branches the wind disentangled itself and spread wetness over the dusty earth. Naruto was almost ready to leave. He was having a hard time remembering what actual sunlight looked like. His companions were shifting awake behind him, but the blonde paid them no heed, cross-legged at the edge of the cliff and staring unscrupulously out into the ether as if it was the sole catalyst for his bad mood. Honestly, it had nothing to do with the weather, as depressing as it was. It seemed that the more he improved, and the closer he got to Kurama, the more he realized just how vast and infinite the channel between them really was. Naruto was not weak. It was almost impossible for him to be weak, now that his body was honed to the conditioning standards of the fox. And he could at least hold his own against the best jounin the shinobi world had to offer. He was leagues ahead of his peers. And with the experience he had gained as a Black Ops came the inevitable precocity and strategic comprehension that all the great shinobi possessed, so he was not lacking in that regard either. Although he would not be quick to jump into captaincy just yet, or ever. He didn't think he would ever be as brilliant as Yamato. Yet regardless of all of that, the fox always proved to be more. Did he really have to train for a millennia or two to be the demon's equal? That was incredibly unfair, the blonde thought irritably. With that logic, no one could ever defeat the fox. It was with both relief and trepidation that he realized that this was not the case. Kurama was cautious by nature, yes, but he had deliberately gone out of his way to avoid certain people, or certain events until strictly necessary. He wouldn't be so apprehensive if he was truly without equal. There had to be people still living on this earth that the fox found powerful enough to be careful with. Naruto shook his head, clearing his thoughts. These were thoughts far too deep for such an unpleasant and early hour. This was why he hated waking up so early, Naruto digressed. It gave you far too much time to think. The blonde stood up, turning around to watch Sasuke blow an unhelpful fireball onto a pile of branches. The Uchiha made a noise of frustration. Judging from the scorch marks around the pile, he must have been attempting to light it for some time. Yujito sighed, shaking her head. "It's too wet," she complained, pinching a lock of hair to scrutinize it with an uncharitable look. It looked damp and limp. Killer Bee scowled. "Well then, what the hell are we gonna eat for breakfast, huh? I'm hungry." "You're not the only one." Yujito snapped, sparing the world around them a dour glance. "And there's absolutely nothing to catch around here." "There's a river somewhere around here," Naruto revealed, drawing their attention. He shrugged at their incredulous glances. "I can hear it." "I guess that's helpful," Yujito snorted. "Where is somewhere? It better not be too far." "Ah, well." Naruto rubbed the back of his head sheepishly. "Can't be too far, right?" Fortunately he was correct, the river really wasn't all that far. But the journey was long enough to elicit a litany of complaints from Killer Bee, and an increasingly sour mood from Yujito. Sasuke had already been in a bad mood. Naruto wasn't sure what he was feeling, an ambivalent annoyance, maybe. At any rate, they found the river without much trouble, but like the rest of this place it was paltry and not particularly noteworthy. Actually, it was more of a stream than anything. The fish were small and ugly, but at that point they were all too hungry to protest. All that training meant they needed to refuel on something other than ration bars and those ridiculous protein brownies Killer Bee had brought along. After that they began the grueling climb. Back up the ravine, out of the sea of mist and back onto reasonably safe ground. He was unprepared for the sight of a very familiar Anbu team, waiting for them at the top of the plateau. He visibly startled, wondering if he was hallucinating. He blinked again. No, definitely not. But then, why would they be here? The border is only a half-hour away, Kurama remarked offhandedly. Naruto paused. Did you do that on purpose? Their presence had Yujito and B on edge, but Naruto waved off their concerns. You know them? B turned to the blonde. Yeah, that's my team, he replied quickly, a little thread of excitement in his voice. He caught a flicker of some kind of emotion on Sasuke's face. Jealousy, maybe? He pretended not to see it though. He knew that the fact that he'd already reached the highest-ranking ninja status was a hard thing to accept for the Uchiha genius. He wasn't going to try to hide it, but he also didn't want to rub it in his face or anything. What are they doing here? Yujito asked mildly. Naruto scratched his cheek. Dunno. He thought on that. They're probably here to drag me back and berate me for being gone for so long. He laughed, only half joking. He hustled over towards them instead of beckoning the two groups to come together. It was probably best to just avoid that whole situation entirely. Hi. He chirped brightly, unsurprised to see that the entire team looked as if they just casually moseyed their way over here, and not as if they'd just gone through a mission and days of travel. You seem to be having a good time, Yamato observed, amused. Naruto laughed uncomfortably. Yeah, well. We're getting things accomplished, I swear. Yamato nodded, appearing to take this at face value. Anything to report? He rubbed the back of his head. Yujito and B are nice enough. They work well together, and have been pretty game to work with us too. Actually, Sasuke and Yujito work very well together. He paused, thoughtful. He's doing better. At this, his captain raised a brow. Oh? Naruto shrugged. I think the time away from the village is doing him some good. I'm sure the training isn't all that much of a hindrance either, Yugao noted. Do you know what happened to his Genin team? At the mention of Sakura, Naruto stiffened. All this time away from the village had made him forget about a lot of the issues he'd been having lately, but he was also losing sight of what was really important to him. He couldn't spend the rest of his life wandering around in the ether. No matter how much he'd come to enjoy it, this journey had an expiration date. I know. He admitted after a long moment. Yugao made a thoughtful noise. Well, depending on how lazy Kakashi wants to be, it might be useful to have him get some one-on-one training. Naruto blinked. With Kakashi-sensei? Yugao shrugged. Or another jounin. Kakashi is a remarkably well-rounded ninja, with a lot of skills to teach. But that also means he doesn't exactly have much in the way of a specialty. It might be good for the Uchiha to pursue a concentrated approach, rather than a general education. To that end, he is also the best person to teach Sasuke about his Sharingan. Naruto mulled this over, nodding. And what about you, Naruto-kun? Yamato prodded gently. The blonde blinked. Well, he hedged, feeling weirdly nervous. It was just Yamato. He'd actually become very comfortable with his captain and his whole team. And he'd never been shy or refrained from bragging about his accomplishments before. I've been making progress too. He answered, shrugging. Fortunately, Yamato didn't press him for more. That's good to hear. Do you have any kind of timeline or estimation of when you'll be ready to return? Naruto opened his mouth, and then closed it. He didn't know. Kyuubi took over smoothly, rolling his shoulders so fluidly it was as if Naruto was the one doing it. Soon, was his evasive reply. Perhaps in a day or two. And then, tilting his head, why? Was there something you needed? Though his tone wasn't particularly remarkable, Yamato narrowed his eyes anyway. He observed the demon coolly, before a pleasantly neutral expression made its way onto his face. It was not an expression that would look out of place on the mild-mannered captain, and yet there was something alarming to it nonetheless. No, nothing in particular, he answered, cheerfully. But it'll be good to have you back. An equally alarming smile lit Kyuubi's face at this. Yugao looked between the two of them warily, wondering what could possibly be going on beneath the surface. For all intent purposes the two were being incredibly polite. She didn't think she'd ever seen Kyubi so pleasant. But maybe that was what had set Yamato on edge in the first place. He's been acting strange, you say? Hatake Kakashi scratched the back of his neck, looking more invested in his porn than he was in Yamato's concerns. Yes. The captain answered, snappishly. He had half a mind to grab that stupid thing by the spine and throw it out the window. And I was wondering if you could perhaps enlighten me to it. Kakashi laughed. Why do you think I know any more than you? Finally, much to Yamato's relief, he snapped his book shut and tucked it into his pocket, providing the Anbu captain with his full attention. To be completely honest, I had assumed you knew more about him than anyone. Me? Yamato blinked. He wasn't sure if he agreed. On the one hand, from an outside party it could certainly seem that way. He spent the most time with Naruto and Kyubi, and to be fair he had probably spoken with the demon more times than anyone else in the history of Konoha. But he wouldn't call them conversations by any stretch of the imagination. The fox was just using him the same way he was using all of Konoha. But what Yamato wanted to know was why. He thought Kakashi might be his best bet, because it was clear the Hokage knew even less than he did. Perhaps the Sandaime could have offered some insight, but something told the Black Ops that the old man would have been equally at a loss as Tsunade was. The demon was an enigma. And there was no one who could possibly enlighten him. There was no one who actually knew Kyubi. But there were certainly people who knew Naruto. He'd brought up a silencing jutsu the moment he'd finally cornered Kakashi in the Jounin break room, not in any mood to entertain his comrades or deal with listening ears. Nobody was around anyway, but it was never a bad idea to be cautious when dealing with ninja. There was no possible way for this conversation to get back to either of them, yet he felt on edge nonetheless. I saw you actually have a working conversation with him, Kakashi pointed out. Yamato opened his mouth to protest, but then Kakashi added, he listened to you. And after a pause, I still don't know how you managed that. I don't either. Yamato answered, candidly. He shook his head then, realizing this was getting nowhere. And what of Naruto, then? Has he spoken to you? We had ramen before he left, Kakashi offered. But the most important thing we talked about was the upcoming release of a new Ika Paradise. Yamato heaved an exasperated sigh. Of course. Why do you think there's a problem here? Kakashi tilted his head curiously. By all accounts, this whole deal is working out splendidly for Konoha. Yeah, and Kyubi's just a bucket of sunshine. Yamato agreed, flatly. He frowned at the Jounin. You don't that his behavior alone is cause for concern? You mean, his good behavior? Kakashi raised a brow. Yes. Yamato affirmed. Have you ever heard the saying, never look a gift horse in the mouth? Kakashi returned, but it was clearly rhetorical. He raised a hand, halting Yamato's response. I'm not saying there's nothing there, but either way, nothing short of an Ibiki-led interrogation will be useful. Yamato said nothing to this. And anyway, who's to say his behavior isn't beneficial to us? There was a dark glint in the Kapinin's eyes, one that did not go unnoticed by Yamato. He swallowed. They both knew exactly what Kakashi was referring to. You think so too, then? Yamato asked, quiet, even though the silencing jutsu was still up. You think it was him? Who else would it be? Kakashi challenged. The best of Anbu have wanted to overthrow him for years. Even the Sandaime had issues with him. I'm not saying he should have been killed, but he held far more power than most were comfortable with. The silver-haired Jounin paused, before adding. Danzu was a very paranoid man, rightly so. I don't think we've even scratched the surface of his undercover dealings, even with the ongoing investigation. What motive, though? Kakashi hummed, thoughtful. I'm not sure. And that's what made him so dangerous an enemy. Motives were normally easy to come by: human greed, power, money, influence. They were all fairly par for the course. Only the deadliest had aims that differed. Even then, they were usually not too difficult to uncover. He had no idea what Kyubi wanted, what he was after. Revenge. But for what? His imprisonment? He should have come after Konoha, if so. The fox was dangerous. He was, perhaps, the most dangerous enemy Konoha faced. Even more so than Orochimaru, Akatsuki, or any of their rival villages. And what was worse, they had given the demon the prime position to strike at the heart of the village. He honestly doubted whether any of them would be strong enough to detain the fox if it truly came down to it. He hated to say it, but that impossible task might fall into the hands of Naruto. The boy seemed to exercise some amount of control over the demon, and his body, and if they couldn't defeat the demon physically, then they would have to rely on Naruto to defeat him mentally. And that already seemed rather far-fetched. It was true, Naruto was a very headstrong, determined, and honest young ninja, but Kyubi was a terrifying immortal demon of immeasurable strength. There wasn't much of a comparison. Am I interrupting something? Came a lethargic drawl from his left. Yamato maintained repose as he turned to face the new voice. To his total lack of surprise, the demon fox in question was leaning against the far wall, just outside of their bubble of silence. Speak of the devil. Yamato cancelled the jutsu, stepping away from Kakashi. No, the captain answered smoothly. Just catching up. The fox raised an amused, cool brow, which clearly said how much he believed that. Nevertheless, he didn't appear to want to press the issue. When did you return? He segued suavely, giving nothing away on his features. An hour ago. The fox replied. The Hokage wished to see me. And you actually answered the summons? He thought, surprised. What for? His scrutinizing gaze slid from Yamato to Kakashi. She wanted a report on the inter-village relations trip. He shrugged. Oh. Well, that was fair enough. He had no idea why he had suddenly come under the assumption that Kyubi was planning to assassinate her at such a random interval. Kyubi had never once displayed any sort of intention, he reminded himself. Kakashi made a vague noise of interest. Well, if that's all, I really ought to see her myself. There's only so many hours I can be late before she puts me on guard duty, you know. Yamato scoffed. You passed that mark a long time ago. But he made no move to urge the Kopinin to stay. Kyubi made even the most confident of ninja uncomfortable just by being in the same room as them, but something told Yamato that Kakashi's disquiet with him was far more personal than that. It must be difficult to separate Naruto, his loud-mouthed and exuberant student, and Kyubi, the demon that had rampaged the village and killed his sensei. Yamato turned his attention back to his subordinate. Well, if you've already spoken to her, why did you need to see me? He raised a brow. Kyubi blinked at him. I was under the impression I was supposed to inform you of my presence in the village. He deadpanned. Oh. Well, that was true. Oh. Yamato said, at length. Well, thanks for that, I guess. But I don't even want to know what sort of exhaustion you've put Naruto through, so I suggest you get some rest. Yamato could imagine this going two ways: either Kyubi would take offense to this, or he would have no discernible reaction. The demon fox didn't appreciate being ordered to do things, but at the same time he wasn't the type to lose his temper. So Yamato shouldn't have been surprised when Kyubi simply blinked at him, before disappearing in a plume of smoke. Well, that went well. In the resonant and dying evening a small form darted through the trees. Half of the moon anchored between two mountains, a turning, wandering light that illuminated the forest in small spaces of color. It was unnecessary. The demon could see perfectly fine in the darkness. The night fluttered uneasily around him. After some time the demon flew through the trees to land in a small clearing of foliage. There was nothing to mark it as significant. In the dark canopy the wind unwinds, disturbing, mysterious and familiar. The singular figure disinterred in shadow and light stood silent and sentinel in the middle of the clearing, gazing upwards. He always seemed to find his gaze drawn to the moon. Not this moon, though. Not even the moon in the speckled night sky. He had a secret softness for the morning moon, a white conflagration upon a forge of blue metals. Finally another shape dropped from the sky. Its plumage was dark like ink, but one bleeding red eye blinked at him in the night. The demon turned towards it, surveying the creature with a look of distaste. He was not fond of birds. The bird cawed once, before erupting into a winter storm of feathers. In the spaces between the moon spill and the falling darkness, a familiar figure emerged. His spinning red eyes met the demon's. "I hope you called me out here for an actual reason. I thought I made it clear that I kept my promises." The demon smiled. "Are you still so adverse to trading information with me?" The Uchiha narrowed his eyes. "Yes, I'm sure you keep your promises, the ones that benefit you, at least. Trading information with you is beneficial to me," Kyubi returned. "So you've no need to worry about that. What information did you want?" The demon was quiet for a moment. "There is a Jinchuriki in the far west, the Chome, I believe." "You believe correctly. What information do you have on it?" The Uchiha appraised him carefully, as if wondering why the fox would be so interested. "The Chome currently resides in Takigakure," he answered, after a beat. "Its Jinchuriki is said to be a young girl. Nin. She is very well guarded." Kyubi raised a brow. "Adequately well guarded," the Uchiha amended. "No guard would ever be of particular difficulty for the Akatsuki. The Akatsuki intend to capture her soon. Do you know which operatives will be sent?" "Haiden and Kakuzu, most likely. They are already in the area for unrelated reasons." The demon frowned. "How long? Until they catch the beast?" Itachi tilted his head. Kyubi nodded. "I'm not sure." The Uchiha admitted at length. "But I cannot imagine it will take them very long. The mission they were sent on won't last longer than a week." "A week?" Kyubi muttered. "What do you intend to do?" "Well, I certainly don't intend for any more of the Jinchuriki to fall into Madara's hands," he retorted. "I'll simply have to take her first." The Uchiha looked vaguely alarmed. "My involvement in this cannot be revealed." Kyubi smiled. "Neither can mine. But the timing will be suspicious nonetheless." "Don't worry about that," the fox waved his concerns off. "I will retrieve the girl, and make it look legitimate." The Uchiha did not look very convinced, but he had to acknowledge that the fox was cunning and swift. If he said he had a plan, then he most likely had a plan. "I suppose I will simply have to take your word on it." "Like I said," the demon smiled again, dark, and full of teeth. "I keep my promises." "You fucking fox." The Hokage scowled irately. "Do you have any idea what time it is?" 3 hours until dawn, the fox returned smoothly, jumping off the window sill. "And if you are still awake, you must have the intention of staying awake until then." Tswanda scowled further. "You're still interrupting me," she pointed out. It was true, and there were at least 5 stacks of paperwork to prove this. "Then hopefully this will go quickly." The Hokage narrowed her eyes, pushing away from her desk to face him. The demon did not say anything, leaning against the window. She raised a brow. "Are you going to tell me what you want?" she challenged. "Or do you want to stand there all night?" "I want to take sabbatical." "You just got back." Tsunade returned, deadpan. "Yes, and the village functioned perfectly well without me." He nodded in agreement. Regardless, you're still a shinobi of Konoha. However unwilling your induction may have been, and I can't have you kipping out on your duties without a valid reason. Who said I didn't have one? Kyubi retorted with a smile. I want to go to Takigakure. Tsunade was silent for a long moment. Do I even want to know? She wondered aloud. The Chome is there, he revealed. And she is in the most danger of being taken from Akatsuki. She is apparently a young girl genin age. She is certainly an easy target for them. The Hokage's eyes widened. The Akatsuki? She repeated. She closed her mouth, searching him closely. And just how do you know this, anyway? Kyubi shrugged. I have my resources, he hedged, in a tone that meant he had no intention of ever revealing them to her. And they are sources to be trusted. Ask that perverted hermit of yours if you wish, he'll tell you the same. So there's a young, relatively untrained and helpless Jinchuriki there, Tsunade began. How exactly do you intend to go about rescuing her? But the fox had already come up with a plan for that. I'm going to take her out of the village. You say that like it's an easy feat, Tsunade responded, incredulous. While we're not enemies with Waterfall, I wouldn't call us friends. You'd need a valid reason to take her. I'm not kidnapping her, the fox replied, amused. The woman made it sound like he intended to sneak into her room in the dead of night and grab her in a black body bag. The Chunin exams are a valid enough reason, don't you think? The Chunin exams. Tsunade repeated, flatly. She is around that age. Kyubi noted. Of course she would take them, and they are being held in Sunagakure, are they not? It would be perfectly reasonable of her to leave her village for early some training before heading to Suna. Tsunade looked as if she would protest, before she closed her mouth, leaning back thoughtfully. As usual, the demon came up with the most outlandish yet believable scheme. There was certainly an element of credibility to this absurd plan of his. The yearly Chunin exams weren't that far off, and many genin do leave for intense training during the period before them. But how would the actual act of enrolling her into the exams even work? Takigakure had few shinobi to begin with. It was incredibly small for a hidden village. Small, and reclusive. Even more than that, Takigakure had very few children. This Jinchuriki was probably one out of a handful of genin. I see. Tsunade hummed, scratching her chin. So you mean to get to her before the Akatsuki, yes? That is the general plan. Kyubi agreed. Well, I think your idea is solid, she acknowledged. You can take the sabbatical. I'm assuming it won't be a long one. A week or two at most. The fox answered. Good. When you come back, you can start your new position as a genin sensei. You will of course take the occasional mission or two with your team, but your priority will be to train your team. For once in the relatively short time she had known the silent and impassive demon, she had never seen so much emotion on his face. She was secretly quite pleased with herself. He was shocked into stunned silence. His mouth opened uselessly. Excuse me? Your reasons are valid. Tsunade said, smiling cheerfully. And judging from the success of your last little trip, you are clearly capable of teaching. Not to mention, Naruto is great with kids. None of that explains why you want me to be a genin teacher, the fox pointed out faintly, with wide eyes and a voice low with hysteria. Technically you need a team of 3 for the Chunin exams. Chunin are passed on individual merit, of course, but there is an element of productivity and teamwork that needs to be assessed as well. That makes the teams mandatory. But there's nothing that says genin from other countries can't be on the same team. After all, it is a multi-village exam, so genin from every country can pass. She smirked. And we have plenty of genin here to fill up the rest of your 3-man team. The fox appeared at a loss for words. After long moments to digest this, he frowned. And you have no compunctions on letting a demon mold the minds of your young, susceptible shinobi? Tsunade laughed. Like you're not just going to fob this all on Naruto, she pointed out. Well, that was true. Kyuubi had no intention of wasting his patience and time with such useless endeavors, so he was definitely going to make Naruto be the one to teach them all the time. Tsunade would not tell the fox this, but aside from that she didn't really believe that the demon would mold the genin for his own nefarious purposes. He was not an Orochimaru. She actually had a feeling he would be a very good teacher, unwilling, but adept all the same. For the second time that night, the demon had no response to this. He was still looking flabbergasted and in awe of the idea at all. Your team has a mission tomorrow, she continued. But after that you're free to leave. Just try to return in a timely manner, yeah? Kurama supposed it would have been ridiculous of him to assume he would come out of this without any difficulties. Between simply leaving in the night to travel to Waterfall or actually going out of his way to get approval from Tsunade, one of those would be infinitely less of a headache than the other. Kyuubi was clever and manipulative, he had no problems prodding people into giving him what he wanted. But he should have expected that there would be some trade-off involved here. Truth be told, this wasn't the worst thing that could happen. She was letting him leave all the same. Letting him leave and not asking questions about it. He supposed genin were a small price to pay in that regard. But he could only imagine what Naruto's reaction to this will be. It was his first mission back, and something about it made Naruto giddy. This was absurd, he should not be this pleased at the idea of assassinating another group of ninja. All the same, he was excited to join his team again. It felt like he just fit with them. Like there was a place for him that was still there even when he left it for a really long time. He was ecstatic, and excited, and really, really fucking confused. A genin team? He repeated, loudly. Are you serious? Why would I lie about this? Naruto's mouth dropped open and stayed there for some time. He didn't even bother to clear his gaping expression until Yugao spared him a curious look. He schooled his features back into something approaching ambivalence. Inwardly, he was still freaking out. I can't be a genin sensei. Naruto protested. I'm practically a genin myself. How the hell am I supposed to teach kids my age? You had not trouble in Kumo, Kurama pointed out. That was totally different. Quite honestly, Kurama didn't think Naruto would have any trouble with this at all. People liked Naruto, once they got to know him. Personally, Kurama found him tedious, grating, annoying on the best of days and downright irritating on the worst. Alright. He may be exaggerating some, but the point was that Naruto charmed everyone he met. Those genin would probably follow him with stars in their eyes after a day or two. I fail to see how. Kyuubi sniffed. You are worrying over nothing. Naruto sputtered hotly. Ioyuf, he cursed under his breath. Why the hell didn't you tell me about this earlier? What have I told you about telling me things? You know, keeping me informed? I'm telling you now. That is totally besides the point. To be honest, this event only came up recently. As you know, I intend to travel to Waterfall and retrieve the Jinchuriki. The little girl, yeah. Naruto nodded. Kyuubi had told him about his plan earlier. He was in staunch agreement with this. For once, he and the fox actually seemed to agree on something. They had to save that girl before the Akatsuki killed her and extracted her demon. The most plausible way to get her out of the village without raising suspicion is to use the Chunin exams as a ruse. The demon explained. Although you do not need a team to pass the exams, you do need one to enter it. Your Hokage so insightfully suggested that the easiest way to go about it would simply be to form a team for the exams. Which means we'll be teaching genin on how to pass the Chunin exams. Naruto said, slowly. Yes. He made a strangled noise. I never even passed those exams. How the hell am I supposed to train someone to pass them if I've never even taken them? Those tests are meant to emulate real situations that shinobi encounter. You have more than enough experience in real-life situations. I don't think that will be a problem. Naruto pouted. Hell. Kurama was right on all accounts. Still, he didn't want to teach Genin. What if? What if he ended up with Sakura? His stomach fell. He had no idea how to feel about that. At least he wouldn't have to worry about teaching Sasuke. The boy was already a chunin. He hadn't seen much of the Uchiha since their return to Konoha, as the boy had been whisked off by Kakashi soon after their arrival. Could only imagine Sasuke's reaction to this. He would probably laugh in his face. Kakashi too. I guess, he agreed after a long moment, lost in his thoughts. It probably wouldn't be the worst thing in the world. And though he may protest it, Naruto didn't think Kyuubi was all that opposed to it either. His trip to the temple had been enlightening, to say the least. Not the actual event itself, but the dreams and thoughts that followed thereafter. The fox did not know that they shared the same dream. It may be impossible to tell what Kurama was thinking from the surface, but his dreams gave way to a character that was very unlike what Naruto would have imagined. The fox was a student himself, once upon a time. He trained in those temple halls. He had felt conflicted, ill at ease, and unsure of himself. He was not always a perfect and indomitable creature of composed control. Actually, he was not at all like anyone thought him to be, Naruto included. Contrary to popular belief, the fox didn't seem to hate humans. If anything, he either held them with indifference or with an ambivalent fondness. The Rikudo Sennin was human. And more important, Lyso were his sons. And Kurama was very close to them. Or at least, one of them. The one that Naruto always saw in his mind. There were some memories that would drift over him at night, full of sadness and longing. Naruto wondered if there was a time when Kyuubi actually wanted to be human. Of course, humans nowadays he found mildly distasteful. All the same, there was a time in his life when the fox was actually quite close with humans. And as for his motivations, well, Naruto had yet to make much headway on that. The fox had said once that he fought for revenge. Naruto didn't doubt that, but he also didn't think that revenge was all there was to it. There was something very personal about the cold, single-minded determination the demon possessed. Something that he cared for very deeply. The blonde was pulled out of his musings when Yamato announced that they were stopping for the night. It would only take them a few more hours to reach their destination, but it was better to arrive in the morning when they were well rested and ready for battle. His team moved about. Tao called first watch. As always, Koga had already left for firewood. Yugao was rummaging around in her pack for ration bars. Yamato had made himself a wooden bench, and had pulled out his sword for cleaning. It was all at once both very familiar and very strange. He had traveled with Yujito and Sasuke for so long that he had become accustomed to their habits. He shook his head, making to start on his own routine. He failed to notice his captain's eyes on him, so busy trying to pretend everything was normal. Fortunately, he didn't have to pretend very long, for his head snapped up with the distant sounds of movement in the shadows. He stilled, looking into the Atramentus forest. Those movements did not sound like the local wildlife. It only took a long sniff to the air and an acknowledgement from Kyuubi to confirm it definitely not a pack of deer. Naruto turned towards his captain, who clearly had sensed it too. The fox took over in the space of a second, raising a cool brow at the other Anbu, as if to ask for orders. Tao was doing the same. "Stay at camp," he said to Tawa and Yugao. And then he gestured to Kyuubi, "You're coming with me." The fox nodded, and then the two were darting out into the trees. He wasn't entirely surprised to see that there was an enemy scouting party in the area. They were in enemy territory after all. Killing a scouting party would draw attention towards them, but at this point their only options were to kill the party to stop them from returning or have them reveal that there were Konoha Anbu in the area. An MIA scouting party would rouse suspicion regardless, but at least this way they could buy enough time to wait until morning before completing their mission. The enemy had no time to react to their preemptive strike. Within moments Kyubi and Yamato had killed them all off swords and melee attacks only, to keep their chakra presence unnoticed. Kurama had not spared much thought on why Yamato had chosen him to accompany him on this, but it became apparent that there was a reason for it when Yamato made no move to leave the scene. Kyubi slid a sidelong glance his way, saying nothing. It was clear Yamato had a reason for calling him out here, away from their team, so he simply knelt on the ground and began to clean off his sword while he waited for the captain to say something. He grew a bit irritated when it became obvious that his captain had a reason to bring him out here, and it was just as obvious that he had no intention of enlightening the demon. "I'm assuming you didn't call me out here for a moonlit walk through the forest," he started, wryly. Yamato didn't even bother to remark on that. He stood some paces away, scrutinizing the demon closely. Kyubi met his gaze without fear, wide spinning eyes giving nothing away. "What are you up to?" he asked finally. The demon raised a brow, gesturing to the blade he was cleaning. Yamato snorted. "You know that's not what I'm referring to." Kurama shrugged, looking back down at his blade. "Why do you think I'm up to something?" Inwardly, he wondered why his captain chose now to confront him about it. It was clear that Yamato was suspicious of him, but he had held his tongue up until now. Yamato turned dark, searching eyes toward the demon. Searching, but not accusing. "You've been far too complacent not to have a secondary agenda." Kyubi did not look up, kneeling down as he cleaned his blade, and after, holding it up to the moonlight to observe the metal. "I thought that would be the foregone conclusion." "It is." Yamato agreed. "But I must admit, I'm rather interested to know, whatever it is, why exactly did Danzu have to die because of it?" "You're being rather curious," Kyubi remarked, neither confirming or denying his part in that whole affair. "You're not denying it," Yamato pointed out. "Why would I?" The demon stood, finally meeting his eyes. He didn't know what it was he saw in them, some sort of indomitable energy, inert, but only in this moment. They were enrapturing somehow. They would ensnare him if he wasn't careful, this strange not Sharingan. Greater men had fallen into its trap before. Well, assassinating an esteemed elder of Konoha might just be considered a criminal offense. Noted the Black Ops captain, dry as a bone. "But you wouldn't be the one to indict me," Kyubi returned, matter of fact. No, of course he wouldn't. Whatever Kyubi was up to, Naruto didn't deserve to suffer for it. The two shared a very deep and complex relationship that he wouldn't even dare touch with a 10-foot pole, lest he wanted to incur the wrath of a severe headache. But this did not mean Naruto was the Kyubi, that he should be roped in with whatever machinations the demon had in mind. If anything, Naruto probably knew even less than he did. But, Kyubi never did anything without a reason. Even now, he had no obligation to humor Yamato, but he was doing so anyway. "No, I wouldn't." Yamato agreed at length. "But that doesn't mean I'm going to let you run around unchecked." Kyubi blinked at him then with large, luminous eyes. If this was his attempt at an innocent look, it was sorely lacking in finesse. "What have I ever done to deserve such suspicion?" "Nothing, and that's the problem." The fox raised a brow. "You've been incredibly non-confrontational ever since that seal broke," Yamato observed. "You could have ran for the hills and reveled in your freedom, but you didn't. You could have went on a slaughtering rampage, but you didn't do that either." Kyubi didn't reply. He merely cocked his head, as if to show a passing indifference. "That you haven't done anything is far more concerning than any homicidal spree you could have embarked on," ended the Mokuton user, darkly. "It means you have a reason for lying low." The blonde Anbu stood then, sheathing his sword and returning it to his belt with what Yamato thought to be fond affection. He made a non-committal noise. "Why does it matter to you?" was the enigmatic response. "I'm no threat to Konoha. At present," he added, low. Kyubi shrugged. There was a beat where neither of them said anything. "Why so interested?" The fox turned to him, expression appraising. "And why now? You've never been all that concerned with my dealings before." "I can't have a vested interest," retaliated Yamato. Kyubi barked a laugh. "In me?" And then he shook his head, a quiet smile on his face. "Or, are you speaking of Naruto?" Yamato paused, before deciding to be truthful. "In both." This seemed to hold the fox in a stunned, suspended disbelief. His demeanor changed then, and he turned fully to study Yamato, scrutinizing him contemplatively. It was difficult to discern what the fox was thinking from his inscrutable features. It was also difficult not to fidget under the deadly gaze. It felt as if the demon had reached into his very soul, opening it up in his hands to peruse the contents. "You've nothing to worry about," the fox dismissed, after a long beat. Was that supposed to be reassuring? He shrugged. "What, do you want an oath from me?" he returned, acidulous and sarcastic. "Yes," Yamato answered, serious. The demon observed him for some time. Yamato wondered if he was being tested right now. And if so, was he passing? Or failing? "Konoha means nothing to me," the demon stated, flatly. "I have dozens of reasons to want to see that village razed to the ground, but to be candid, none of them are truly enough to motivate me to do so. I hold the place in such low regard that it is in no danger from me. Still, if it suits my purposes, I have no problems in protecting it." Yamato blinked. That was perhaps the most straightforward, explanatory answer he'd ever gotten from the fox. And one that, perhaps, he should have expected. Kyubi's dismissal of Konoha came from a genuine indifference to the village as a whole. He probably wouldn't ever attempt a legitimate attack, if only because he held the place with such impartial indifference that he wouldn't want to needlessly waste his energy. And if there was one thing Yamato could count on, it was the fox's dogmatic conservation of his energy. It was Yamato's turn to pick apart the demon. "I have to admit then, I'm at a loss," he said, truthfully. "If that's not your aims, then what are they?" To his total lack of surprise, the demon did not answer. His returning smile was particularly cruel. "I already told you that Konoha has nothing to do with them," the fox pointed out. "What do you care, if your village is safe?" He shrugged. "You're my subordinate," he said, like that explained anything. Kurama shook his head, silently marveling once more on Naruto's innate ability to inspire such fervid loyalty in so many people. He couldn't even pinpoint what it was in particular that made the blonde so amenable to everyone, and he had been trying to do so for some time. His Anbu captain cared enough about him to accost Kurama and interrogate him on his dealings, not out of concern for his village, but out of concern for Naruto's well-being. The demon fox's lips twitched, this time with no malevolence to speak of. "I'll remind you that I'm more than capable of taking care of myself," he noted, amused. Yamato raised a brow. "That's true," he allowed at length. "Call me a nagging mother hen all you like, but I still would prefer to know what you're up to." Kyubi's expression turned particularly bemused at that, both brows shooting up in surprise. Yamato sighed then, exasperated. Maybe he was being a bit too ambitious with this. What, did he expect the demon fox to divest his most intimate secrets? "Although I suppose if you're not in any immediate danger, then I don't need to know much else." The fox remained silent for a long beat. "I am not in any immediate danger," he said, in a low voice. "But I do intend to take sabbatical to Waterfall." This, Yamato was most certainly not expecting. His eyes bulged. What? Waterfall. Kyubi repeated, patiently. I plan to go there. Yes, right, but, Yamato sputtered. Why? Why waterfall? And then, like this also wasn't completely insane, I intend to find the Jinchuriki there. Kyubi tilted his head, innocently. Yamato looked at him blankly. Why would Kyubi want to find another of the Jinchuriki? He had horrifying apocalyptic scenarios flash through his mind, before he decided to think rationally on this. Why the Jinchuriki? Well, if my calculations are correct, then she's around the age to take the Chunin exams. I plan to train her to take the exams in Sunigakure next season. He blinked rapidly at that. And you think the Hokage will be alright with this? She already approved it, Kyubi returned, much to Yamato's shock. Unfortunately, I think she intends to saddle me with other Konoha genin, but I suppose that is a small price to pay. Yamato wondered if, at some point in this conversation, he'd lost his goddamn mind. So you are voluntarily becoming a genin teacher? He remarked, flatly. Most jounin spend their entire careers finding elaborate ways to get out of being a genin teacher. One only had to look at Kakashi to see just how ridiculous those schemes could get. And even Kakashi was eventually dragged into it. And yet here was Kyubi, perhaps the last person he would ever assume would have the constitution or motivation to teach small children, voluntarily subjecting himself to such a horrifying fate. Going out of his way to do so, actually. That appears to be the most logical course of action. Kyubi replied dutifully. He wondered vaguely if the fox was fucking with him. They were supposed to be tricksters, right? Why? The fox spared him an annoyed glance. As I said, I intend to find the Jinchuriki and train them to an adequate level to pass the Chunin exams. The most straightforward way to accomplish this would be to bring them here. I'm going to assume the Jinchuriki from Takigakure would be a Takigakure shinobi. Yamato pointed out flatly. Kyubi raised a brow. Are we in bad relations with Takigakure? Well, no, as I recall, the teams are only noteworthy for the first and second tests. Ultimately Chunin rank is decided on individual merit, so why would it matter if one team was composed of members from different countries? Yamato frowned. He was fairly sure Kyubi was breaking some rule somewhere with that, but at the same time, if there was such a rule he could not remember what it was. It was mostly a logistical explanation as to why teams were always from the same country. Genin teams were composed of 3, and genin teams always came from the same country. Even villages on good relations with each other wouldn't ever let their shinobi get so close to another, or ever even think about combining genin to form teams for the exam. Yamato had never heard of any multi-village team ever competing in the exam. But like he had theorized earlier, there weren't very many opportunities for that, so maybe this was to be expected. What did Tsunade say? He asked, pained. How did the fox always manage to get himself into the most ridiculous of scenarios? More importantly, what was going on in his head? She approved, he replied, succinctly. I'm leaving once this mission is over. Yamato's look turned incredulous. Finally he sighed. What exactly was he supposed to do if the Hokage had already approved? You realize you haven't actually given me a legitimate answer to anything I've asked, he pointed out, pained. The fox blinked at him, smiling winsomely. Yes, he clearly realized this. Kyubi laughed. Like I said, I am in no immediate danger. They may not be enemies with Takigakure, but he still couldn't imagine that a trek that far alone would be without difficulties. He couldn't help but wonder if the Hokage had thought of that. Kyubi was capable of holding his own, true. He was clearly a far more experienced ninja than anyone gave him credit for, but he was also just one person. And more than that, he was a Jinchuriki. He was just as much a target as that little girl. Surely she couldn't be planning on simply letting him leave? Just like that? Upon their return to Konoha, it became clear that the Hokage had no intention of letting Kyubi go to Waterfall alone. Because they were apparently going with him. Thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed it. Make sure to like and subscribe, and don't forget to share this video with your friends. Guys, make sure to help the author by visiting the link in the description. This is Fox Sage, and I'm signing off.